This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Can I just ask everyone to make sure your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Today's actually part one of a two-part investigation that we're doing into capital projects in London. Tomorrow we are looking at delivery, whether we can deliver projects faster and cheaper. Today we're looking at financing. How is it possible? Is it possible for London to stand on its own 2 feet and not have to rely on government funding? Before we get to that exciting stuff, though, we've got a little bit of housekeeping to do. So can I ask our clerk, Hannah Barlow, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assemblymember Desai. Assemblymember Baker is here as substitute.
Morning. Welcome, Assemblymember Baker. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 regarding declarations of interest and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Good. Well noted. Can we note the membership and chairing arrangements of the committee, the terms of reference and the standing delegations as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025? Can we confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 20th of February and the 19th of March to be signed by me as a correct record? Good. And can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from its previous meetings and the additional correspondence sent? And action taken under delegated authority, can I ask the committee to note the recent actions taken by myself as chairman of the committee, namely a letter to the Mayor of London regarding reflections on the 2025-26 budget process attached as Appendix 1, and a letter to the Mayor of London regarding climate budgeting and Green Finance Fund attached as Appendix 2. Good. And can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor of London on reflections on the 2025-26 budget process as attached at Appendix 1? There we are. That was quick. And now we come to the main item of business today, which is paying for and building transport projects in London, part 1. So if I could welcome our esteemed panel of guests this morning. We have Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. We have John Kavanagh, Programme Director, Infrastructure at Business London. We have Chris Whitehouse, Technical Director at WSP. We have Maurice Lange, Analyst, Centre for Cities. We have Manish Gupta, Corporate Finance Director from TfL, and Lucinda Turner, Director of Spatial Planning at TfL. Good morning, everyone. So if I kick off, perhaps to you, first of all, Tony, about the spending review. Obviously, much was hoped for. Where do you think London stands in terms of funding major capital projects in the light of, we've now had a budget and a spending review under the new government?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to come and give evidence to the committee this morning. I think the spending review does give TfL 3-4 years of reasonable certainty in terms of grant from central government, and that is a good thing. There are conditions attached to it in the shape of a requirement of some degree of oversight by the Office of Rail and Road, which is, I think, new, but my colleagues from TfL will correct me if that's if I'm wrong about that. So that's okay so far as it goes. It's 3 to 4 years of or 4 years in total of reasonable stability. But what that sum doesn't really do is provide the reasonable hope of being able to proceed with DLR extension to Thamesmead, the West London Orbital or the Bakerloo line extension. So it's sort of good, but only good up to a point. Okay.
Manish, from TfL's perspective, where do you think you stand on, particularly on capital projects?
Thank you, Chair. So I think from a TfL perspective, our view is that this is the first time we have had long-term settlement from the government, which we welcome. We can always do with a bit more money, absolutely no doubt about that. But I think the 2.2 billion settlement, we feel it's positive in the sense that it allows us to deliver the new Piccadilly line trains. It allows us to deliver some of the new DLR fleet that we are in the process of procuring. A new signalling upgrade for the tube, which covers about 40% of the tube capacity, which is good. We should be able to procure new trams for Croydon. We can progress discussions on new Bakerloo line trains, although they remain unfunded, as Tony rightly said. And I think we can spend a decent amount of money on some of the major roads in London. But at the same point of time, as Tony rightly said, I think TfL has a Victorian network, and we have a substantial backlog of maintenance as well. And therefore, while the overall settlement we are very positive about, I think we are looking forward to working with government on trying to get settlement on DLR Thamesmead, which we are actively working on, and on some of the other growth schemes which Tony has referred to, which is BLE and West London Orbital. So hopefully, but I think, as I said, the main point I would emphasize is that it allows us some clarity on our longer term strategy, and therefore we can actually work towards a bit of a longer plan for TfL.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in general, so you've outlined, I suppose, TfL's standard approach to major capital projects, which is to ask the government to fund them. That's not a new development. But there have been a couple of projects in recent years, the Nine Elms extension of the Northern Line and the Silvertown Tunnel, dearly beloved, I know of everyone in this chamber, just over the way there, which were funded not by that mechanism, but by other mechanisms. How applicable are they, do you think, to potentially other transport projects or other infrastructure projects in London?
If you like me to cover that to start with. So I think there is probably 3 different methods by which we finance new projects. The first one is we fund them on a balance sheet. So I think we are not entirely reliant on government for all funding. So TfL currently has 15 billion of debt on its balance sheet, and most of that has gone into investment on new projects and new capacity. The second method, obviously, is that we can borrow money by way of public-private partnerships, and Silvertown was a very good example of that. And the third method is, as you rightly said, the Northern Line extension, where a lot of money actually was obtained from what we call land value capture. Crossrail was funded on a very similar basis, and we can get a bit more details into each of those examples. And as we are looking at how we fund new projects, including DLR Thamesmead, there is a substantial focus on maximizing what we can actually get from London by way of fare pairs, by way of land value capture. And at the same time, also looking at every possible method of delivery we can get. And if we think PPP is the right method, then we will basically go with that. But I think we have to look at every possible option and see what would work best for TfL and the user.
Understood. Well, in fact, almost as if we'd planned it that way, that leads on nicely to, I suppose, the main topic of our meeting today, which is what are some of those alternatives. So perhaps if I can go to each person in turn. We'll cover this in more detail as we go on, but just a quick sort of opening comment on what you think are the funding mechanisms, besides just asking government for money, that we could look at. So I don't know if you want, perhaps you don't need to add anything to what you've just said, Manish. You've probably covered what are the...
I think, why don't I come back after the panelists have had a chance to respond to the question?
Okay. Maurice, what are the options that aren't just asking government for money?
It's not definitely the only option, but something that we've looked into at Centre for Cities is the potential for using land value capture, and specifically on the uplift that can be captured from greenfield sites. So that would be the money that could be made from urban extensions, and so if you have captured the uplift from the value of the land at existing use value, or if you're purchasing it close to that price versus what the price is for market development, you can coordinate development to get money, which can then be used either for that site, or if you come up with another mechanism through Section 106 or through others, to go for pots with money which could fund other things. I can tell you more about that in detail later, but everything I have to say relates to that specific mechanism on greenfield sites as opposed to other ones.
Understood. Thanks, Maurice. Chris, what are the alternatives to government funding?
Thank you. Building on what's been said before, the study we looked at was related to the land value capture, and hence moving away from the requirement to get grant funding from central government and looking at ways to identify revenue streams that could be unlocked by the unlocking of land and development that the transport investment would produce. So looking at sort of tax incremental finance modelling, where you have, as has been said, having future revenue streams to pay the upfront costs. And the study that WSP undertook with Business London was looking at potential of drawing on the sort of current existing revenue or sort of tax streams that exist try and sort of keep it sort of practical and hopefully more implementable in the near term, and looking at the opportunities from residential associated taxes such as council tax and stamp duty tax, and also, as we mentioned, the Northern Line extension to Battersea drawn business rate supplements. So looking at the tax streams that are created when new developments take place to pay back upfront borrowing was what we looked at, and therefore moving away from needing to ask for the upfront cost in a grant from government.
Thank you. John.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think as we were talking about sort of in the pre-brief with Lucinda and others, it's government will always have a role. So it's not about sort of cutting government out entirely and saying that London can wholly and entirely fund these projects on its own balance sheet. But it's about kind of coming up with these innovative funding sources which reduce the amount that the government has to put in so that London government can take the majority of the costs. So range of different variables. If you think about the Northern Line extension, for example, that was funded for a tax increment financing scheme which was heavily based on commercial developer contributions. But then the level of affordable housing that was delivered at that site was reduced so that developers could make up a bigger contribution towards the infrastructure that was delivered there. So that was a trade-off that was kind of known about and kind of openly discussed and agreed at the outset. The model that Chris and I worked on in our report on land value capture was looking at the residential potential. So could we use residential taxation, hypothecate future stamp duty and future council tax to go up to fund infrastructure up front to deliver the TfL growth schemes that we're talking about today. We can come on to more detail about that, but range of different options to consider, but I think ultimately many of them are sort of political considerations. So if you think about that NLE example, that was a political decision about affordable housing. Developer contributions went into funding the infrastructure and unlocked a range of commercial investment that came into the site at Nine Elms.
Thanks very much. I think that's a good point about the trade-offs. You know, these things are not free. There are no free lunches, as it were. Tony, did you have anything to add on options?
Well, I mean, it's worth remembering that London, we all know this, pays substantially more in total in tax than is spent in London. So London is capable of generating tax revenue with investment. But the difficulty is we live in the most centralised country, so England within the UK in terms of public finance, in the world. So nothing can happen unless the Treasury sanctions it. And it's not just a matter of the Treasury funding it. That's the way they've gone with High Speed 2, 100% government funding, whatever it costs. But in London, what we need is access to mechanisms that allow developments to go ahead. And the Treasury at the moment, slightly lacking in imagination, can't bring itself to say, well, if London isn't going to get money for these new schemes, why on earth can't it be given a more off-the-shelf and bespoke opportunity to access tax increment finance deals or PPPs or whatever back in fashion these days, in a way that allows it to access its own potentially rising land values in order to capture the uplift, in order to help fund its own projects and generate fair income. But at the moment, London's neither going to get the money from central government for these projects, nor, as far as I can see, access to the schemes which would allow it itself to fund them, and that is a lack of imagination.
Thanks. That's a good point. It's not just about financing, it's also about politics. Susan.
Thank you. Perhaps, Tony, you could take a look at this one. The Northern Line extension and the Silvertown Tunnel were both projects that were started under previous mayoralties, which, of course, Sadiq Khan has inherited. So what large-scale infrastructure projects will the mayor's successor inherit, do you think?
Well, as your question implies, any mayor is slightly in the hands of the government of the day. So when projects go ahead, like the Elizabeth Line, the Victoria Line before it, it depends on a moment in time when a national government gives London, whatever the government system is at the time, the capacity to go ahead with schemes. And you have to say that the end of the previous government, the Conservative government, and this Labour government have not been over enthusiastic about giving London resources for big schemes. It's a consensus policy across the political divide at the moment that the rest of the country will be given money for new schemes. London, neither the money aiming off for the settlement for TfL, nor more importantly, this capacity to access mechanisms as the one, you know, the Northern Line extension was a brilliant piece of government in many ways. It got government and city government here at City Hall to work together to create a scheme to allow the capture not just of land value uplift but also of tax yield, so it accesses property tax yield as well, in the name of delivering a tube extension, a spur off the Northern Line, which in turn allowed the Battersea development to go ahead. You could do that in several parts of London that need this kind of support. So I think it's a matter of will in central government and, as I said earlier on, imagination. It requires imagination in Whitehall, which I think they find difficult.
Yes, which therefore means that his successor probably won't inherit the same sort of...
Yes, but if the current mayor's successor doesn't inherit one of these schemes, it will be a bipartisan non-inheritance from central governments of two parties.
So do you think the mayoralty, this mayoralty, has got any kind of vision for new transport infrastructure?
Well, we know that... I can't speak for the mayor personally, you'd have to ask him that, but Transport for London...
He never answers, Tony, anything I ever ask him.
You can ask him. TfL has a perfectly respectable list of priorities, and I mentioned them earlier on, I'll go through them again, we all know what they are. Personally, I think TfL needs to be a bit more ambitious and put Crossrail 2 back on the agenda. I know there's some members of the committee think more smaller projects should be delivered, but I think the thing about these bigger projects, these game-changing projects, and there's no doubt the Elizabeth line was that unless they're put on the agenda and successive mayors or city leaders in London push for them, they never happen. So you've got to keep the pressure up, and eventually the stars will align and the government will allow Crossrail 2 to happen, and Sutton will be linked to North East London, and that would be a good thing. So so I think we've got, you know, TfL and the mayor, at any mayor, any party in TfL have to think about ensuring these projects, big and small, are on the agenda, because if they're not on the agenda, they just don't happen.
No, that's true. I mean, given your sort of comments, do you think it's sensible to do short-term things like freezing fares as opposed to putting money into building up money for infrastructure?
I mean, one of the defining differences between the Mayor of London and the other city regional mayors is they have access to this vast fare yield. So 5 to 6 billion, TfL correct me, it's about 5 to 6 billion. And that is an order of magnitude, scale of difference to anywhere else in the country. Obviously, the more money, I'm going to answer the question directly, the more money that can be brought in through fares, the more money there is to spend on the existing system and invest in the future. I think to some extent, as I remember the deal that's been done with City Hall as part of the spending review is going to require RPI plus one fare. Is RPI plus one fare increases? So that's going to limit the mayor's freedom not to put the fares up. Personally, I think over time, fares should rise in line with earnings to keep a balance between what people are earning and what fares can reasonably fund. But that's just a personal view.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody got anything burning, Manish?
I can add a bit of a perspective from TfL, Susan. So I think number one, in terms of the projects that we are working on, so in absence, if we have the money, the schemes we would like to deliver is definitely DLR Thamesmead, West London Orbital, Bakerloo Line Extension. We are working with DfT closely on Euston upgrade. Obviously, it's a high-speed 2 station, but obviously there's a TfL, substantial TfL interplay under the station. So those are the 4 schemes which we are quite keen on. Obviously, I totally take Tony's point that if we had an indefinite amount of money, Crossrail 2 would definitely be on the agenda, but I think it's quite a substantial scheme.
Okay. Can I pick you up on something you said earlier? You said that TfL has got a large backlog of maintenance. Obviously, for all of us that travel, that is concerning. Is the money in place for correct maintenance? Because if nothing else, we want to know that the trains are safe and maintained properly?
So safety is absolutely paramount, Susan, so you can be absolutely assured that all the money that we are getting from government is being prioritized entirely for new expansions, which we have talked about, so Piccadilly line trains, and absolutely ensuring that the trains and the network is absolutely safe to run. So signaling, for example, 40% signaling upgrades are happening on the tube. So I have no concerns that TfL is absolutely focusing on safety. But I think at the same time, we also, going back to the point around funding for more infrastructure, I think it's fair to say that we can spend a lot of money on new schemes if we had the amount of money. And but we are also very conscious that there's a limited budget, and we have to find a way to manage in the budget.
What's the ballpark figure for the backlog of maintenance?
I would not have a number handy.
Approximately.
I would not have a number handy. We will have to come back to you on that.
Is it millions or billions or?
I would not be able to answer that question, Susan.
But surely, if you actually brought up that there's a massive backlog of maintenance, surely you must have an idea on how much the backlog of maintenance will cost, because that money's got to be put aside before you start looking at spending money on other things. So who would know how much backlog maintenance? Give us a ballpark figure on that.
We will have to come back to you, Susan, on that.
Lucinda, have you any idea?
What I know is that the £2.2 billion that we have got will be targeted at the maintenance and renewals and will tackle those issues. So it will deliver the signalling upgrades that Manisha's talked about, the other issues that have built up during the kind of COVID period. So
billions we're looking at. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take a section called "Who Needs What Needs Funding," which seems to be lots of things. Tony, I feel like you could write a book on this, but just thinking about projects like Brent Cross West, or indeed the Elizabeth line I took to get to work this morning, to what extent does investment in new transport infrastructure in London enable the government's ability to meet growth and housing targets?
I think that there's an extraordinarily convincing literature on the way in which appropriate, let's go for it, infrastructure investment will deliver economic growth. The government has a growth agenda, and there is no question that one of the underlying challenges for the UK, both in terms of growth and productivity, has been a failure to invest. You just talked about failure to maintain. And again, it's a bipartisan, multi-party approach this over time, the failure to see the benefits for growth and indeed to avoid the kind of, going back to the discussion about maintenance, London in the 1970s and 80s was not a great place because of a long-term failure to invest in the underground and the bus system, and it's taken 20 years to catch up. And there's always a risk, you can see it in New York, that if you allow it to fall back again, there's never enough money to catch up again. So I think both in terms of the need to keep maintenance every year at the level necessary to stop the infrastructure depreciating too fast, or indeed net at all. So I do think that there's no question the UK as a whole, and therefore London within it, which has very high productivity levels, they're not as high as they once were relatively, needs to invest to drive up productivity and to deliver economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And when there's a sign at Colindale Station, which is just being rebuilt, and all the concrete has a big stamp saying "Made in Cornwall," which I think it neatly illustrates that when we invest in our transport network in London, the country seems to benefit. I don't know if there's any wider examples that you could give on that.
Could I just
please
add just in relation to the sort of three priority schemes that have been mentioned in terms of West London Orbital and the Bakerloo Line and Thames Mead Extension. as part of the study we did, TfL undertook some analysis, and for those 3 schemes, it was identified that they would sort of potentially unlock the order of 100,000 new homes and sort of 10,000 new jobs. So that's kind of the sort of quantum that one could achieve through significant transport investment.
Absolutely.
If it helps, I can give you some data. So TfL had done a study in 2024 assessing how much economic benefit is being redistributed from London into UK through the supply chain. So based on that data, and that report is in the public domain, but that report basically said that in 22-23 and 23-24, TfL spent about 12 billion with more than 3,000 UK-based suppliers, which supported about 11 billion in total gross value added across the UK. It about 197,000 FTE job years, equivalent to supporting employment at about 98,000 full-time positions. And in addition, there was about £9 in every £10 spent by TfL suppliers was basically on domestically based suppliers. 6 billion in the UK with 3,000 suppliers in 23-24, 62% were SMEs, and there's a whole lot of other data there. So that report is in the public domain, which basically shows how much value the TfL is actually providing to the UK supply chain.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm just aware there's so many more questions, although we could stay on this one question all day, but I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Hall.
Yeah. I'll ask you, Tony, because you've referred to it. I mean, if you think about it, London hasn't got the money that we were hoping for in any which way, despite the Mayor constantly saying that give me a Labour government and, the sky's the limit. And London continues to be the biggest driver of national growth. It certainly provides the biggest return on investment for infrastructure projects. So given that you said that Labour have come in with a growth agenda, which to my mind is laughable, quite frankly, with what's gone on in the last year. But do you think that the Labour government is really thinking quite backwards here, because it should be putting far more money into London to drive that growth?
I think there's little doubt that a fair distribution of resources, including London around the country, would produce, and to your point, would produce, if you invest in London, it will produce significant levels of economic output. Just to go back, though, to Assemblymember Clark's question, point, and I think that even with the Elizabeth line, though some stations around the Elizabeth line did deliver a large amount of growth, some didn't. And particularly if you look across central London, and given that the original calculations that were made about economic benefit in relation to what is highly environmentally sustainable growth in the middle of the city, but it is around any station actually, there's been more development at, let's say, Ealing or here at Custom House or at Ilford than at Bond Street or Farringdon. And I do think that that is an issue that we need to think a bit more about for the future when schemes of this are delivered. I realise that's a borough issue, but coming back to your precise question, I think investment in London projects will produce higher levels of land value capture. We know from the amounts that boroughs and the Mayor will collect in community infrastructure levy in Section 106. It's a far higher sum. These are far higher sums collected in London than anywhere else in the country. So there's enormous potential here, but until and unless the Treasury is willing to work with London, I say not just to give London money, but to give it access to its own capacity to deliver projects that would produce tax and growth.
We're in agreement. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, just on that, the planning authority around Bond Street, of course, is about to change, so it won't be a borough issue. It will be a mayoral development corporation that controls the area around Oxford Street, just for the record. So perhaps the mayor's plans do include some development in the area. We await news. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. Good morning. This is a question for Lucinda, Chris and John. We've heard a lot about the main priorities already. So of the ones of which we've heard, or maybe ones which we've not heard about yet, if you had to decide today that only one was going to be going forward and that you could greenline it right now, which one would it be? Yeah. The one which you think is going to be the one that's going to be absolutely transformative, game-changing, and can be delivered.
There are slightly different factors involved in that, aren't there? Because if we had unlimited money, my answer might be different. But the one that is closest to delivery and a fundable kind of scheme with a package of different contributions, the closest one is DLR to Thamesmead.
Thank you. Chris?
I don't have opinion, really. I think they serve different different purposes, sort of different roles and different ways they could come through. So I wouldn't sort of express an opinion as to which one to favour.
Fair enough. John? You're going to be bolder?
Not sure. I don't think boldness on there choosing favourite schemes, but
well, it's not favourite. It's the one that you think is going to be, going to deliver the most return, the one which is going to be the most vital. Whether it's going to be unlocking new housing and all of that, and there's just going to be one.
Yeah. Well, I think the three growth schemes that we've referred to, I think the point that we would make as Business London is that they have the biggest potential to unlock that private sector investment and development, so that if you build DLR to Thamesmead, you unlock hundreds of thousands, potentially of tens of thousands of new homes around that site. And the other thing about that scheme is that you're also addressing providing sort of social value for those communities. So there's high levels of deprivation in and around the area, so you're providing connectivity that provides onward routes to employment, access to jobs, and routes into the centre of the city as well. So it's not just about kind of moving people around, it's about social equity and about the communities you're sort of benefiting from those projects. But again, I think it comes back to if we can identify these innovative funding models to bridge the funding gaps for these projects, then we don't just have to pick one. We could potentially, be rolling out multiples of these projects in London. Again, and then we come back to the point about devolution, which was made earlier. If there was a better deal for London, greater incentives on the London government to be delivering these projects, because they're being held accountable for delivery of those projects in line with the London Finance Commission recommended originally a long time ago.
Thank you. Oh, listen.
Yeah, I just think it's worth putting this into the context of the scale of the growth that we kind of need to deliver within London. We have a housing target of 880,000 homes over a decade. So, I mean, we need all those schemes, kind of frankly, to deliver the growth we're talking about. This is productive investment. It's a shame, isn't it, in this country that we get into zero-sum games of London versus other regions and then schemes versus other schemes within the London context. As I say, I think the phasing, the kind of what will come first is linked to the feasibility, the kind of level of design, the funding package. So they will need to be phased. And as I say, DLR is probably the soonest we could do, but we need all of those if we're to deliver that scale of growth.
Excellent, thank you. That was sort of new priorities, but old priorities. This is one for Manish. It's Hammersmith Bridge, which, I mean, we got this far in the meeting without mentioning it. How likely do you think it is that Hammersmith Bridge repairs will be wholly or part funded by the £1 billion Transport Infrastructure Fund?
I actually don't know, is my honest answer. I think we know we don't have funding for Hammersmith Bridge and we need the funding. We are in conversations with government on how that is done, but at this point of time, we don't have funding for Hammersmith Bridge. So I think it's one of those which will need to be worked through.
Thank you.
Lucinda?
Yeah, we are definitely making the case to central government that we should have access to the Structures Fund as other parts of the country. We feel kind of strongly that would be appropriate. We know that the letter kind of says by exception and by agreement, so we are certainly making that case.
Thank you. And at the moment, we're looking at 250 million, so a quarter of the £1 billion pot. If the case isn't made, the old method was going to be what the previous Deputy Mayor for Transport came up with, and now Transport Secretary. Heidi Alexander of a third. Is the third still viable, or is that now unaffordable?
I think in the context of if TfL has to fund a proportion of that, we are, so since we have had the CSR, we are in the process of going through our business planning exercise on where the 2.2 billion will actually get allocated. So we have a proportion of that we have identified for users. The rest of it is going to go through a priority process. And I think at the end of the year, we will have a better view on where we can prioritize the money.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thanks. In fact, the point you made, Lucinda, I want to just highlight about zero-sum thinking. That's actually, I suppose, the driving force behind this investigation, is that if there are projects that deliver a positive investment return, then they shouldn't necessarily be in a zero-sum battle with some other project. We ought to be able to find a way to fund all of them all at once in a world of abundance that we hope to achieve. Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Before we move on, I just wonder if I could ask Manish, Lucinda, how you could, we've talked about what the big priorities are and sort of outlined what those big capital projects are. What's the process? How do you determine which of those projects are a priority? How do you do that ordering? Why are the top three the top three? Could you explain that to us?
A complex process with lots of different factors.
It's not a tombola then, no.
I mean, part of it is bottom-up driven by the work across London in terms of where does the housing growth kind of need to go. So linked with the work on the London plan, joining together with where the opportunities are. There's opportunity areas, lots of brownfield land, kind of, and bottom-up as to what are the requirements to unlock that housing and to deliver sustainable communities. There's also strategic kind of reviews. There have been projects that have been on the kind of books for some time that continue to make sense. Kind of in terms of prioritisation, that's where it gets really complicated because it is comparing apples and pears often. Some are very housing focused, some are the big schemes deliver the kind of productivity benefits, and that's the process we go through in the kind of business planning round, but with partners, kind of, etc. But a key factor is how feasible is it to kind of identify potential funding sources that could help get them over the line. Because as I said, I don't think we will get away from needing central government capital kind of investment. Our aim, as has been said, is to minimise that and show what other funding sources there are to get them over the line. And frankly, kind of sometimes also it's a point of time. So we can't run every scheme at the same time. They inevitably need to be phased. And we do the design and development work and the business case work. And as I said, at the moment, we are furthest progressed on DLR, but there's work on BLE, there's business case development there. There's lots of work with West London Orbital, part funded by the boroughs. So third-party support and alignment with kind of local kind of authorities and their support and their willingness to put the kind of money where their mouth is. There's a whole range of different factors, and clearly central government have kind of views as well, but there's a lot of analytical work to go into what genuinely, what's the BCR, what's the kind of bang for buck that we get from the different projects, but it is comparing quite different things sometimes.
If I can add a little bit more to that, which is a very helpful response by Lucinda, is that I think I don't want the committee to take an impression that we are focused entirely on the larger schemes. I think there's a balancing act, so obviously because larger scheme is, look, you get one scheme and it can deliver a lot of value. But at the same time, I think we don't underestimate the benefit of some of the smaller schemes as well. So things like, for example, ZEB buses. So London has about 9,000 to 10,000 buses, and only about 3,000 will be ZEBs by the end of next year. And that's clearly something that needs work. Now, any number of buses that get converted to ZEBs is better than not having anything. So that's almost a live program where how do we accelerate the conversion into ZEB buses? Yeah. So that's small programs. Things like our Places for London subsidiary, which is the property subsidiary for TfL, has recently done a joint venture called FastNed on EV charging infrastructure. So that's, again, an incremental change funded entirely by Places for London. And that creates an incremental impact on London as a whole. So So I think there's a balancing act of how do you actually get some of the larger schemes in place, at the same time make those incremental changes that do actually make a substantial difference across London.
Yeah, it's a really interesting answer, and it's coming on to what I was going to sort of, well, without stating the bleeding obvious, basically, which is these big capital projects that we're talking about that at the moment are depending on government funding, but this is what we're here to discuss. Those are primarily about growth, expansion of London, internal expansion of London, not to set any hairs running. But obviously there's lots of work and capital funding that is put into the keeping the network effective. I'm thinking about rolling stock upgrades, signalling and stuff like that. So I suppose that the balance is interesting to me, that money that we already have, that those few years of committed funding is going on making sure the network continues to run for those people that we have, but that everything additional is about growth, additional housing, stuff like that. Is that unfair? It seems sort of obvious to me, but I just wanted it's worth sort of clarifying that, I suppose.
I mean, clearly the maintenance and renewal of the existing system has to kind of be done right, yes. And have that funding kind of committed to it. But within that money and that capital programme, there are enhancement kind of schemes. It's not just like for like keeping things kind of going. And you mentioned Colindale Station, for example. So there's what...
I'm not sure I did, but I'm happy to hear about it.
Sorry.
Oh, did you? Sorry.
I'm enthusiastic enough for a sport.
Sorry. So Colindale Station was mentioned earlier, and we have something called the Sustainable Housing and Accessibility Fund, which is a relatively small fund, but that leverages third-party money, developer contributions, borough contributions, to put together funding packages for some smaller scale capital enhancements that are growth related. I mean, Leighton Station is similar. We've accessed housing infrastructure funding from kind of MHCLG. We've got step-free access kind of programme that the Sustainable Housing kind of fund also. So there are programmes of enhancements within that kind of business plan. It's not just.
Yes, so the line is blurred basically, yes. And having walked up those steps at Leighton many times, can't come quickly.
If I can add a little more context as well, yeah. I think we need to keep in mind that TfL is one of the very few transport organizations globally which actually generates operating surplus.
Yes.
And I will not underestimate. So basically what that means is that all our operational maintenance, day-to-day maintenance, some of the renewals are actually funded entirely from our revenue base. So I don't want the committee to get an impression that all the expenditure we do is only dependent on the 2.2 billion we got from the government. There's a proportion of, so that 2.2 billion, it actually ends up funding a lot more because a lot of the money is actually coming from TfL's own generation. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say that there's a substantial focus on trying to expand revenue sources outside the fare pair. So things like you would have seen a recent advertising contract that generates extra cash for us. Places for London generates about 100 million per annum in revenues, which is used to basically fund its own cost, do some developments, and also pay dividend back to TfL. There is about 1 billion other revenue that TfL generates from various sources, including road user charging. So all of that money is basically going straight back into the network for essential maintenance, expansion, renewals, in addition supported basically by the grant we get from government.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are those then trade-offs if you need to make additional revenue from services so it means you're not simply just running a transport network. But just finally, you mentioned sort of zero-emission buses and other sort of smaller scale, but equally important transport infrastructure, and also sort of improvements for walking and cycling and all this sort of stuff that sort of goes on anyway. I suppose, could you comment on whether the ability to, the requirement for large amounts of money for the big sexy projects, I know, like Bakerloo Line, like West London Orbital, DLR, and the difficulties of raising the money, and the ease of doing improvements that are smaller scale. Does that affect decision making in any way? Either way, just because obviously that's just then that's a complex picture you've got there.
So I don't see that as a binary choice, one or the other. I think it's both. So there's a balancing act. So I think, as I mentioned, that I think from our regular cash flows and the funding, we have enough flexibility to allocate that funding to various schemes, and the number of small schemes will be prioritized for that. On the growth schemes, so let's pick up DLR, for example, we don't have funding for that. So we are very clear that the money that we have got allocated, that is not going to be heading into DLR because we can't fund it ourselves. So therefore, we have a very clear allocation of what we will be able to fund or potentially able to fund from the funding settlement and our cash flows. And in addition, the growth schemes will have to be specifically entered into from a funding perspective. I think, so that's really our expectation. So I don't expect, there is no plan to try to just focus on one large scheme at the cost of a whole lot of smaller schemes.
Thanks very much. Would any of the panel like to comment on any of that? Got anything to say on any of that discussion? No. Tony, are you leaning forward or not?
At the risk of opening an enormous portal into another part of the universe, I think that given that the government is in the middle of the most radical railway reform since the railways were privatised in the 90s, or before that, nationalised in the 1940s, the future of the non-intercity rail system in London, when GBR comes into existence, is definitely something that needs some policy attention, because in the white paper that was published by the government in December last year, they promised that there would be real opportunities for mayors to take greater control over this railway. As far as I can see in the bill and its guidance, there's not much about it at all. So I think it's going to, let's put it the other way around, it'd be very odd indeed if the government takes over the whole of the railway, which it's going to. And then in London, half the railway is run by national government, half is run by TfL. I mean, that won't make sense. So there is a big issue as to, in starting, would TfL want to, be capable of, and take it over? There were discussions when Patrick McLaughlin was Transport Secretary about doing this during the previous government. So I think that's a big issue because it has profound ramifications, given that would bring into, if TfL were to take over many of these lines within London, has profound implications for development and all the issues we've been talking about this morning.
Yeah, thanks. I was steering away from rail devolution, even though it's one of my favourite subjects. But I think the important crossover there is that if there is an opportunity for some of those lines to be run by TfL, run by the mayor, then what money is going to be associated with them? Because it's not just, some of those lines have been starved for money for quite some time, and there's going to need some investment if they are going to drive housing growth and
but if they're not going to be handed to the mayor, then question, how will they be run? Because, within many of our lifetimes, they were run by a subset of the old British Rail called Network South East. And indeed, here and there in London, you can still see the sort of physical signs of Network South East, City Thameslink, for example. So the question is, if it's not going to be run by TfL, what regional or London agency will there be within GBR to run it, which can be accountable, for example, to this committee?
Thanks very much. Transport Committee might feel that they ought to have some accountability as well. So that concludes our section. Yes. So Assemblymember Baker is chair of the Transport Committee, subbing here today, for those of you who don't follow our internal activity. That concludes our section, I think, on what we would like to fund, our shopping list, if you like. So we now move on, I suppose, to the big topic, which is what are the options for funding all of these things that we would like to pay for which we return to Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to go into, well, we're going to go into the details of various methods, so please restrict yourself from commenting on any detail. But just to ask, so there are obviously existing ways of raising levies on development that have been used. There's public-private partnerships, there's obviously government grants after general taxation, and there may also be sort of other ways that we don't use very much, innovative ways of land value capture, bonds, all this sort of stuff. So without going into the detail of those, because others other than the committee will do that, do you have views on what the respective benefits of different types of options are for funding different types of large-scale capital projects? Does that make sense? Basically, which types work for different types of schemes? And does anyone have any views on that? Go for it, Manish. Thank you.
I can happily make a start.
Yep.
And do interrupt me if I go too long. But I think I would probably make two general comments at the risk of, and probably seeking your indulgence a little bit. I think I think it's important to differentiate between what is funding and financing, because I think that's quite an important point. So I think, and this is where I'm probably overemphasizing my indulgence. So I think the way I define it is that if I equate it to buying a house, so I'm the person funding the house because the only person who can pay for the house is me. But the mortgage lender is financing the house. And as long as the mortgage lender is comfortable with my ability to pay, they will lend me money. If I want to buy a house which is 10 times my wealth, I will not be able to fund it. So I use that example, a very simple example, to equate to funding infrastructure. And the reason is that there's only 3 sets of parties who can fund infrastructure. One of them is the fare payer, which in the case of London generates about $5.5 billion of revenues from the fare payer. The second one is a taxpayer, which is the government, central government largely. And the third is the beneficiary, which is where land value capture comes in, which is where, any form of economic gain made in London, if you can find a way to capture that, that actually comes into us, right? So those are the 3 broad funding methods. I think I see PPPs and bonds, etc., are purely a method of financing.
Sorry, IC PPPs. Does everyone else know what that is? PPP, public-private partnership.
Partnerships.
Yeah. So
yeah.
what's
So
the IC?
Sorry, apologies.
He sees them. It was I see them.
Oh, you see PPPs. Apologies. I'm with you now.
Apologies for using...
Honestly, Gareth, that confused me even more. I was like, what on earth is going on? Apologies, Manish. I completely understand where you are now.
So I think PPPs are a method of financing. And therefore, the way I see it is that there's only 3 payers who can pay. There's only 3 sets of people who can actually pay for the funding. And what we are doing is to see how much economic value can be captured in London, because it does create a substantial economic value. So having said that context, I think all of those methods, to the extent possible, are relevant in the right situations. Not every method is relevant for every situation. So the way I see it is, it's horses for courses. Each situation has to be looked at, and I think in some cases we think PPPs are a fantastic method of delivery. In some other cases, land value capture would work the best, and so therefore we have to explore all possible options.
Lucinda.
Just a few further reflections. I guess what I would say is that for particularly larger scale schemes, we probably need to explore a pretty wide range of mechanisms, because no single one is likely to kind of get you to the percentage funding we're talking about. I would say for Crossrail, kind of BRS and Merrill-Sill were key, and the thing about them was they covered a broad area and were relatively stable. the narrower the area you go and the kind of higher the percentage, the probably more volatile it becomes, and the kind of probably less certain over a period of time. So again, it's factors like that in terms of what is the particular scheme we're looking at. TIF only tends to work when there's commercial development involved rather than residential. So it might work for somewhere like Euston, it worked for NLE, but won't in kind of for DLR to Thamesmead, for example. And there's other kind of aspects. I mean, net operating surplus will come into this, but there are risks with that. And I think the other thing is we need a range of mechanisms that come in at different times, because many of the mechanisms we're talking about come after delivery of the project and only kind of are available then, but most of the cost is up front. So we get into quite expensive financing mechanisms. So are there some within the packages that we're looking at, are there some that can deliver sooner than others? So a whole kind of range of different factors, but I think on most of the schemes we're looking at, we're having to look across quite a broad range to get to the type of contribution we're talking about.
Thanks. And I think implicit in both your answers is that it is possible to combine some of these. It's not, there's not, you would not have to pick one. You could, Is there anyone else who'd like to comment? Tony, gesturing.
I mean, obviously, as I said earlier, perhaps getting ahead of this discussion, there's a need for sort of intricate negotiation at the moment to make any of this work. The Northern Line extension was done by huge amounts of negotiation for a one-off scheme to get that the development unlocked at Battersea Nine Elms. I assume somewhere, possibly involving people at TfL amongst others, an equivalent negotiation is currently going on about Euston. Now, Euston is an extraordinarily complicated development because it involves HS2, who are 100% government funded, but also with an expectation that somehow magically the private sector will be conjured into action to produce land value, capture resources. But we don't have any idea really how that's all going to work yet. So, as I said earlier on, I think the challenge that London faces is not that it couldn't raise resources from fares or tax or land value capture, but there's got to be mechanisms, and indeed borrowing in many cases, in order to allow the scheme to go ahead in the first place, in order that repayments can then be made in the future. And, as I said earlier on, in a country as centralised as the UK, this puts massive amounts of power in the hands of the Treasury, and the Treasury, it's way down their list of interests, I'm afraid. Sorry to be nasty about them, but it's impossible to exaggerate how much more London could do for itself if there were more willingness to be flexible and imaginative in Whitehall.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to come in on this question? John?
Just to come in on the Euston example. So we're doing a lot with our members who are developers who are interested in investing into the station site there. One of the conversations we're having with DfT, for example, is about the application of a land value capture approach, because you've already got existing connectivity at the station. So if you were looking at a value capture approach which was capturing the benefits of the HS2 connectivity, you'd need to be clear that the uplift that's caused by HS2 was captured. So it's that incremental approach. So I guess the wider point is that the different funding models are a bit dependent on the schemes and about the sort of the level of development that's available, the connectivity that's already there. It was much easier to do a land value capture approach at the Northern Line extension because that was a new piece of connectivity. There was no existing station at Nine Elms for it to, so that all of that connectivity benefit and all of that land value generation that was applied was able to be captured through the model because it was a new scheme. So it's kind of, you have to look at the scheme on a one by one basis and apply the model that's applicable, I believe.
Thanks. And I think some of my colleagues are going to ask more specific questions as well. So I think that's back to you, Chair.
Great. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. I suppose a question for Tony, John and Chris here is how could you require contributions from beneficiaries of transport infrastructure, such as local businesses or landowners, to be done in a fair way to ensure that it's proportionate?
Shall I start? I mean, I think, I mean, sort of building on the previous discussion, I think there is a key role to identify the beneficiaries of the infrastructure, and that clearly helps in terms of the messaging and the sort of the promotion of the scheme to sort of those who pay for it are the ones who benefit from it. And then similar, actually, as John just picked on there, for the Northern Line extension, if you're looking at they're looking at business rate supplements, it was fairly clear that you've in effect had an undeveloped site, and you can there clearly identify the sort of geography in which beneficiaries will be sort of located, and hence apply the sort of the revenue streams through that. And I think that's sort of the idea of using existing sort of tax measures at the moment would allow, again, that sort of either both geographical and temporal definition that following, for example, sort of a planning permission or some approvals for major infrastructure, you're then looking to see what developments are then put forward following that date and within sort of the red line area as being the beneficiaries. And there are, again, there's research that talks about distance decay around sites for transport, etc. So you can sort of identify who's in there. So I think there are ways to sort of define who the primary beneficiaries are, whether you're going down a residential route or a commercial route, alongside obviously the actual users themselves can be part of that pot. So I think there's that opportunity. And then again, the discussion earlier sort of showing there's a portfolio of tools, so you wouldn't be using one mechanism. If it's maybe a more localised scheme, then a Section 106 or a developer contribution clearly can be worked into it. So it is, echoing what's been said before, having that flexibility, a range of tools to frame them so they're proportionate to the investment being sought.
I mean, one of the problems, because of the centralised nature of everything, including the local government finance system, there is no way of delivering developments which allow TfL, City Hall, the boroughs to capture what the uplift in land value and what in any rational system would be consequently paid by business ratepayers or council taxpayers in a way that would happen in another city. So if we're in New York City, it's possible. In the High Line, the famous High Line was built in this way, in part. So it was decided to take this old railway, turn it into a linear park, and one of the ways it was paid for was by the city changing the zoning rules to allow more development round it, and that in turn, I think I've got this right, produced a higher tax yield which helped fund some borrowing in order to help the project. Can't do that in London because, and we're in the middle of this process to the Fair Funding Review, which of course adjusts the amount that councils collect from business rates and receive from business rates and ditto council tax in a way that has nothing to do with the yield in any one local authority. So then we're reliant on Section 106 and CIL, which are, one is a levy, the other is a relatively clunky piece of negotiation, which of course makes all development that much more difficult. Other local authorities in the country don't charge much Section 106 and CIL. They go for tax competition, but London does use a lot of CIL and Section 106 negotiation. So we're back immediately, and this is why the tax increment finance deal at Battersea Nine Elms was both a good idea but a complex idea, because it required effectively the Treasury to cede control over the growth in the tax yield from business rates, and so, I think it was just business rates, at Battersea, it could have been council tax, for 25 years to produce a revenue stream, but it required a one-off agreement. So, as ever, we're tangled in the weeds of the local government finance system, which, by the way, going back to the Fair Funding Review, and we haven't mentioned this so far, not much evidence, but I hear is not going to be great for TfL in terms of what they now keep from the business rate and what might be true in the future. But I don't know enough to say much more than that. So it's not I'm keeping something secret, I just don't know more than that. But many of the changes in the Fair Funding Review are not great for most of inner London and possibly not for TfL either, GLA TfL either.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, just coming back on some of those points, Gareth, on the, I think there's a sort of prevailing Treasury orthodoxy, I think there has been over recent decades, that tax revenue is always substitutional, so it's always moving money from one part to another. So if you're giving more money to London, then you're not giving it to somewhere else. Whereas I think the point that we tried to make in our land value capture report was around additionality. So if you invest into a certain infrastructure scheme in London, you unlock a higher level of development than would have happened already. And therefore, if there are new houses that are being built because you've built a new piece of connectivity infrastructure, then is it not fair that those new developments, because they have been caused directly by the introduction of the infrastructure, should contribute towards its funding? So I think there's a need to sort of move away from the kind of slicing of the pie more towards a kind of growing the pie, because you're investing in new infrastructure that unlocks growth that wouldn't happen anyway. I think there's a really a key point around our report on land value capture and additionality on that.
Thank you. One of the beneficiaries of schemes such as this that we've not really talked about so far is passengers. Do you think there's any rationale or justification for new extensions, new schemes, to have some form of dynamic pricing, so that if people are tapping in and tapping out at new stations, that they pay just a small amount more, but that goes towards the costs? I've stressed this isn't Lib Dem policy, by the way.
I was writing a leaflet as you were saying it.
I'm merely hypothecating. Do you think that there is an argument for that sort of thing?
I mean, personally, if it's a choice between a new piece of infrastructure being built or not being built, then the idea of perhaps a short-term additional charge for a new piece of infrastructure would make sense, yes. I think at the margin, if people are prepared to pay for an improved service that wasn't there before and pay a premium for a while, then why not use that in part to help provide the underlying funding for the piece of infrastructure?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I don't know whether you wanted to comment on TfL's view on people paying more for new trains, or perhaps whether you want to just keep well out of that.
I would probably keep out of that.
Okay. Wise.
Never be afraid to ask.
Yeah,
well, some people did come here today on the Elizabeth line, and some of us didn't. So I don't know whether those people have a view on whether they should have paid extra for the service that they enjoyed this morning. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying that I enjoyed my journey in on the Elizabeth line this morning, but I'm very, very grateful to it. So I'm going to start with John and Chris, and then perhaps move to Manish with this question. So just going off what Tony has said through, thematically in terms of this morning, very much about additional innovation in terms of funding, new potential funding streams. Lucinda, you talked about the challenge very much in terms of growing London internally, in terms of the growth that we need economically and from a housing point of view. In my work leading on the devolution bill and response and white paper from the Oversight Committee, I've looked at other cities and how they have funded significant growth in their metro systems as part, and how they funded that as part of this work. And if I give some examples, we've got Madrid, who have trebled their metro system in just over a decade using bonds, PPP, local allocation of national taxes, and the tax increment funding, which we've heard time and time again. If we look at Milan, they have funded a new metro line using, again, PPP, tapping into the European Investment Bank, and interestingly, which I think, Manish, you've touched on, advertising and naming rights, which we normally see for international, or for stadia rather than for stations. And most recently in Paris, where they have got a new orbital route across Paris called the Grand Paris Express, 200 kilometres of additional line, and they have a specialist transport tax that they have, a special transport tax which they are levying locally to contribute towards the funding there. So to start off with, John, Chris, how do you feel that TfL should be looking to fund those 4 projects that we've talked about time and time again this morning, so the West London Orbital, Thamesmead extension for DLR, Bakerloo line extension. What, from your learnings, do you feel that we should be using to apply for this? And then come back to Manish.
Thank you. I think I sort of would suggest that it's, again, drawing on points made previously, it would be a basket of funding, and the point was made earlier that the more innovative funding mechanisms are not sort of the silver bullet, and they're not going to cover the whole cost, but they can make a sizable contribution, and you may well want to draw on different types for different schemes. It's, as we've touched on before, the Thamesmead extension is sort of opening up a new sort of landlocked sort of site with tens of thousands of homes. West London Orbital is more about sort of serving existing areas, but a densification side of things. And then Bakerloo is probably a bit of both, Bakerloo line extension. So you've got different beneficiaries who will come through that, and thinking about how to avoid overly burdensome upfront costs that would impact the viability of actually the housing and the commercial developments going forward, leads to a suggestion of borrowing in order to bring that forward. So whether that was through a bond, or the TfL colleagues talk about what their views are on raising bonds, etc., or whether it's through the TIF model. Again, when we were looking at options, one of the attractions to us of promoting this evolution of the TIF model is that it's established, it's been tried before. As Tony has said, it was quite bespoke and quite, I believe, arduous, the negotiations to get there. But if you could roll out more of them, you get a more templated, more straightforward way of doing it that would sort of take away the friction for it. And in the way we were looking at it was looking in anticipation of borrowing from, say, the National Wealth Fund or the Public Works and Loans Board, but the principles would apply to borrowing from the private sector pension funds or other sort of sectors there. So I think that's sort of the idea of avoiding the upfront costs and the government grants, then using this long-term borrowing to draw it back. Is sort of the way we were thinking of going through. I've forgotten my other point. I'll stop there.
I think there's also a point around different sort of land ownership structures that exist in different parts of the world. So there's an example that's always held up about Hong Kong MTR as a world-leading example of land value capture, but the obvious difference there is that the Hong Kong government owns the land on which the development takes place, whereas if you take the site at Euston, for example, there's land owned by DfT, there's land owned by Network Rail, there's land owned by developers, so hence that sort of need for a negotiation about the different funding mix from those different ownership structures. I mean, Maurice might have more to say about sort of a land assembly approach where you bring those different partners together. Obviously, that's quite complex in London, in a dense urban environment. Potentially easier where you have big greenfield sites in rural locations where you can, as a single landowner, and the land value uplift is much more straightforward to recognise rather than in sort of really complex urban environments like in central London.
Maurice,
sorry,
go on, Chris.
And again, actually, sort of tying to sort of my conclusion, I was meant to pay it again, tying the earlier point, is that it does, as Tony said, it would then need the powers, as our study said, it's really asking, can those powers be given to the mayor so that then they can actually, as you say, sort of reclaim the tax, the revenues themselves.
And I'll come back to the powers for a follow-up question, thank you. But Maurice, and perhaps specifically around these projects that we've been talking about this morning.
Yeah, so I think it's difficult for me to speak to the specifics of the projects that we've been talking about, because most of the research that we've done relates to trying to estimate potential land value capture on flipping greenfield sites to residential. But the same sort of principles about why public land ownership would be important would apply where you go. So it's not necessarily the case, John, that like a public land assembly approach requires you to have only a single landowner that the state is going to buy land, or an existing public landowner. Yes, in Hong Kong, the state does own all of the land, but they're also private leasehold or whatever. But if, as has been recommended by the Curzate report and capital GLA Commission reports, more widespread approach to the public sector buying land, and then managing what happens on top of that land afterwards, after planning and after early stage development, and then realising that uplift is a way of ensuring that you secured the maximum uplift that you could have done, assuming that you bought the land for as cheaply as would have been possible to have secured through other land value capture mechanisms operating on top of a private development mechanism like Section 106 or SIL, if that makes sense. Could speak about like the way that you can use the existing mechanisms quite flexibly for transport. I was in Leeds recently, and they've managed, it is a greenfield extension, but it required a substantial extension to their a dual carriageway, so it was a kind of £150 million worth of infrastructure was required. And there were 60 different landowners, some of which there was options for existing developers, and some of it was landowners who didn't want to sell for development at all. And in that situation, the Section 106 was used to close a funding gap between what was offered from West Yorkshire Combined Authority. So there was a 60 million funding gap to close, and then they negotiated with all the potential developers to say, we'll have a roof tax per unit through Section 106, which is not the only mechanism that you could use to get those hypothecated revenue streams, but it is the one that's easiest to use at the moment, save for the public sector buying all of the land and doing much more of the development itself. And that is to say that in any of these situations, like Euston sounds like a complicated situation, I wouldn't be able to speak to the specifics, but you could anticipate, if you have a proactive state which anticipates development coming forward, and it does that not just in sort of like, oh, we need this thing to happen next year, but it's a 10 or a 20-year development horizon, and it's assembling land, then it can realise those uplifts. On Paris, for example, a large amount of the money that does come through to repay the bond that they've taken out is from public sector selling land that it assembles well in advance of that project ever coming ahead. And I can speak more about our modelling, and I think it speaks more to the potential for residential development that isn't directly related to a particular project to fund other transport upgrades more generally, but it also requires a discussion of releasing land for development, which is not currently within London's existing borders. And I can speak about how much money we think that could make, if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great, Maurice. Manish?
Yeah, thank you. So just addressing a number of points you made, which were quite helpful. So number one is, in terms of sources of funding, I think we would welcome any possible source by which the cash inflow into TfL increases. So whether it's a fare-paying passenger, you know, if you're willing to levy more charges, if there's TIF, any form actually increases the cash flow to us, and therefore that increases our ability to fund infrastructure, right? So that's number one. So to give you an example, in the case of DLR Thamesmead, where we mentioned that we are in active discussions on agreeing with government what a funding plan could possibly look like, we have done detailed modelling on how much additional money we can raise through passengers, you know, through additional passengers who will flow through the network. That creates an operating surplus, and TfL will borrow against that operating surplus to finance the project. Similarly, GLA actually get additional money from various forms of taxes it generates, SIL, for example. And again, we are working with GLA to see how much additional money it can actually borrow against that future cash flow to basically finance the project with the balance money coming from government. So that's one example. So I think any form of funding we can increase into TfL is super helpful. In terms of accessing various sources of financing, so we currently have 300 million from National Wealth Fund, which has been used to fund the DLR trains, the new DLR trains. We are in final discussions with NWF to increase that funding available to TfL, and that's very attractively financed funding for us, number one. We have 2.5 billion of EIB debt, which was obviously all taken before we exited EU. Since Brexit, EIB does not fund UK any longer. It's not part of its remit, but we have existing funding of 2.5 billion from them. We are also looking at capital markets, direct financing being raised by TfL. Actually, at the most recent finance committee of TfL, which is in the public domain, we took a paper on updating the board on this front. And the reason why we can do that is we have a credit rating which is very high. It's AA. And we want to absolutely ensure that we maintain that credit rating, because that allows us the right to borrow at a very cheap rate from the institutional markets, pension funds. And that really, obviously, the lowest is our cost of capital. The more efficient is it for financing new infrastructure. So hopefully that gives you a good summary of some of the initiatives underway with us. I think a couple of other comments is MTR is a very good example in my view. I think actually in my previous job, they were a client for me for a long time. And they generate 40% of their revenues from real estate revenues. So I think, we probably will not hit that number anywhere even close to that. But I think the whole idea of setting up Places for London as a focused property subsidiary for TfL was to allow us to generate additional cash flows from our property portfolio through development. And so over a period of time, that should start generating more cash flows for us as well.
Thanks, Manish. And obviously on that last point, I think it's very much open to where the market is at any given point in time as well, so it can fluctuate. It's not a guaranteed earner. Just specifically, Lucinda, you referred to the DLR being closest to, in terms of sort of getting it across the line, so to speak, from a funding point of view. What is that mix that you've currently got in terms of funding streams to, and what would be the final bit to sort of push it over the edge in terms of from inception to delivery?
Manish may want to come in as well, but it's still under discussion, but we're looking across a range of mechanisms around local kind of SIL sources, around the net operating surplus, around direct developer contributions, around kind of other tax kind of if there are opportunities. I'm trying to say it is a range of sources that are still in flux because the discussions are ongoing, and some are clearly more deliverable than others, but we are committed to getting to that point in the full business case by autumn, so we'll be able to update more then.
Thanks. And Manish, I don't know if you had anything to add, but particularly I wanted to just ask, when we look at European models, they seem to use bonds far more than we do so here. Is there a particular reason why we don't do that?
So on specifically on bonds, I think, so if you look at the history of TfL has used an extensive amount of bonds in capital markets pre-COVID. During COVID, we had a constraint on how much money we can raise. And that's why we decided that we want to go back to capital markets. And that's the paper I mentioned, that we are hopefully later this year, we'll be back in capital markets on the back of credit ratings. So we do expect that to remain a sensible source of capital for us. Going back to DLR, just to add one more point, I think I would be unable to give numbers at this stage because it's in discussions with government. But what we have offered is that we can maximize any sources of capital from London, and that's primarily on account of all the TF, various forms of tax incremental financing. In addition, as I mentioned, that we have done fairly detailed modeling of how much additional passengers will flow through the TfL network, and that creates more cash flow for us, and we will borrow against that on our TfL balance sheet to be able to finance the project. So I think that's really the situation we are in, and I'm hoping we can reach a good settlement with government in the autumn.
My colleagues are going to ask around land value capture, including things like which I've seen elsewhere about stamp duty that goes specifically to the local authority rather than going to the national authority in terms of income stream, for example, for those new houses or homes that would be developed in a particular area. In the current devolution bill, it talks about competencies that currently exist being able to be devolved, but new taxes would have to require additional primary legislation unless there was an amendment to that bill. Is there an opportunity within the current devolution bill that could formalise some of the things that we are doing on a regular basis, particularly around some of that share of stamp duty, for example, or in terms of that, so that we could actually see that happening sooner rather than having to go through negotiations time and time again? I don't know who wants to come in on that one, Tony or?
I mean, I read the press this morning which says the Chancellor has overruled the Deputy Prime Minister in the matter of a tourist or an overnight bedstay tax in London. I mean, we are back, so it's a great question. There are a number of ways in which freedom for the mayor or the boroughs to raise resources, or indeed to retain resources generated by growth, which is, a separate issue, could be delivered. But we are again and again and again up against the, I haven't been nice to them this morning, the Treasury's unwillingness, let's do it as nicely as I can, unwillingness to countenance reforms that would generate incentives, that would generate growth. And to the point one of my colleagues made, it is curious, that institutions such as the Treasury, full of people who understand about economics, do operate as if there's a sort of fixed amount of growth in the United Kingdom or fixed amount of GDP. Everywhere can grow at once. The Northwest, the Midlands, London, Southwest, they could all grow at once if the incentives are strong enough. And the trouble is with these arrangements, the incentives for councils or for City Hall to develop are incredibly weak. Now, that's not to say they won't develop for other reasons. There are good reasons for development beyond just, but holding the revenue and being able to reinvest it, and the London Finance Commission precisely came up with this model. The idea is it would be possible for the mayor and or boroughs to benefit from the growth in the tax base, and that would give an incentive not only to sustain and increase the tax base growth, but then to reinvest it in infrastructure. But we are a light year away from that position.
Sorry, go on, Maurice.
I completely agree with what Tony just said. We've got a paper coming out next week talking about weak incentives for English local government. But one thing I would say about the current legislative environment is that when it comes to public-led land assembly, there have been significant changes that were made in the Levelling Up Act in 2023, and then changes to the sort of way that those mechanisms could be operationalised forthcoming in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And so if you are thinking about what opportunities there are to get revenues from land value capture on this mechanism, the potential to buy land at a price closer to existing use value is far more substantial than it was 2 or 3 years ago. That being said, these new powers haven't been provided secondary legislation to guide them with, but I expect that to come quite soon from central government. And then once that's in place and once a few test cases have provided the legal case study, then local authorities and the mayor should be in a stronger position to buy land and use that as a future revenue stream. And TfL and GLA should be planning on the basis of those things continuing to exist.
Thank you. And actually you came on to what was going to be my final question. So obviously we talked about sort of tax rate raising, but in terms of planning powers, and we've talked about London Assembly powers quite over and over again this morning, but anything else that we could benefit from in terms of planning powers that others have that we could, would help us progress the objective of developing these proposals? Maurice?
Again, it's something that we'll talk about in the paper next week, but I think something that's interesting when it comes to compulsory purchase or land assembly in general when you're comparing the UK to abroad is not necessarily that we have particularly weak compulsory purchase powers. We actually have quite strong ones. But we have really weak planning. And so if you were thinking about comparing France, a land assembly zone, which they would designate as part of their zoning process, and then that becomes a place where the public sector can assemble land just on the basis that it's in the public interest for this specific area to get redeveloped or regenerated or to be an urban extension or whatever. And then that is the grounds for the CPO. At the moment, our CPO process doesn't relate to something as broad as that. It relates only to really specific projects, which can make the process more difficult. Again, the government is bringing in some changes which should make it a more broadly applicable thing. But on the planning side of things, if you made it that in an action area or a housing growth zone, those things described what the eventual development would look like in a more detailed manner, such that it could then dovetail with the compulsory purchase process in a more streamlined way. That would make our planning process and our land assembly process look more like it does abroad.
Yeah, just a few further thoughts. We've worked hard to kind of join up land use and transport planning, and the development of these projects we're talking about is absolutely integrated with how can it deliver homes, how can it unlock growth, how can it do that sustainably. So I think that has changed over the last kind of 20 years, and that is absolutely front and kind of centre of it. I do think, I agree though, that perhaps a more active role for the public sector in land acquisition. Alas, that requires upfront money as well, but we know it works. And an interesting example is Barking Riverside Extension and BRL and their role as the master developer kind of in that area, and kind of trying to de-risk some of that planning and some of the upfront infrastructure, and kind of work with private sector partners to kind of on plots of land, which is a bit more similar to how kind of some of the French kind of schemes and others are done. But I do think a kind of broader role in that context would be very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Assembly Member Georgiou.
I timed that exchange, and that was about 22 minutes. So hopefully, Tony, Maurice, and John, when we go through our questions, we can do it a bit quicker than that. So I feel like we've addressed some of these points already, but please only contribute when I come to you if there's something that you wanted to add, because we've gone through quite a bit already. So how do you attribute increases in land value to transport infrastructure investment? So if we start with you, Tony.
Just to check I answer the question correctly, exactly what, forgive me, it's my fault, what's the point, the question, what's the
So we're on land value capture.
What about?
So how do you attribute increases in land value to transport infrastructure investment?
Well, there's the way we do it at the moment, which is by a mixture of mayoral sill, so a sort of effectively a levy on development. As I said earlier on, I'm sorry to get ahead of the game, it would, in a better world than this, it would be possible for transport developments to take place where the impact on local property values led to changes in council tax and business rates payments, very controversial, which would then be captured as part of the natural process, because at the moment, at some level, Section 106 and SIL and business rates and council tax, they kind of overlap slightly in terms of their impact. But as I've said, the local tax system does not work in that way. So we're left really with the current mixture of the levy, SIL, and the negotiation, Section 106. And following on from the conversation about compulsory purchase, I mean, that would make it easier to be certain about the yield of such development for transport purposes. But we come back again then to the idea that it'll be easier again if you can get the Treasury to agree to a tax increment finance deal, as happened at Battersea. And I think it's hard to believe that's not going to happen at Euston. Hard to believe Euston could possibly work without it. So I'm not sure that gets us much further on, but no. This is a very, very tightly circumscribed system.
I agree. I think that comes back to John's point, doesn't it? You've got so many stakeholders involved in the Euston scheme. Or I think it was John, or apologies if I missed someone, that effectively assembling that package becomes very tricky.
Well, and there's a real risk at Euston that all the major partners will want to spend the same pounds on what they want. So I'm just taking a punt here. I'm just guessing Camden will want to build lots of social and affordable housing. HS2 will want to build a new station for HS2. Network Rail GBR will want to build a new station for the old station. And TfL will want to create a nice link to Euston Square. Well, you know, these pounds are going to be working very hard unless we've got a forest of 85-storey skyscrapers. So, you know, and the fact that we don't really know what vehicle is to be created and what the rules are to be, you know, means that it's very hard for anybody looking in from the outside to see how it will work. But it's hard for me to see how it will work without very high levels of development indeed.
Thank you. John and Maurice, are either of you got something to add other than what you've contributed already or what Tony's already said?
I mean, it's a really good question, Alessandro. I think there's no exact science in terms of you can never sort of accurately predict if you put DLR extension, that's going to contribute to X amount of property uplift in the local area, for example. So some of it is a bit of a gamble at the outset. There is a bit of risk in terms of the development not materialising at the scale at which you envisaged from the outset. But I think London projects have a history of showing that where you do invest in those connectivity projects, and the Elizabeth Line Crossrail is a good example of this, particularly the areas around station sites do see significant uplift, or most of them do. So, for example, the Abbey Wood station, there's been a 6% increase in land values or development, since that station was introduced, controlling for if that station wasn't there. So there's been a TfL study that's looked at that and said that 6% is primarily caused by the connectivity that you've put in. Paddington, there's a similar piece of work which has looked at commercial property transactions, been 150% increase in commercial property transactions at Paddington since that station was built there, which shows the level of interest of businesses locating close to that station site. So you can never predict with full certainty what the ongoing sort of benefits are going to be, but if you look back at historical versions of London projects, then you can take a relatively sort of educated guess that there will be those benefits, and you can then capture them through such things like a land value capture model.
Thank you. Maurice?
Nothing major to add except agree that it's different things for different sites. One thing you could imagine is, we've got the idea of a golden rules for green belt that has in it a series of asks, most of which relate to affordable housing. You could do a greater viability assessment ahead of your Greenbelt review, such that X, Y, Z is likely to come through, a certain amount is likely to be generated from development, such that you can then make additional or trade-off asks as part of, okay, this is our golden rules for this chunk of Greenbelt are 40% affordable housing and X contribution to the upgrading of the local train station.
I'll be careful because you don't want to go down the Greenbelt route with me in this meeting. We will be here all day. I can promise you. I'll beat that 20 minutes from Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Very happy to.
Right, John. So this one's just for you. So should existing businesses and residents be required to contribute to the costs of new infrastructure, or just the new developments that are enabled by it?
So I think the way that we looked at this in our land value capture report was that if you're looking at new development that's been unlocked, then it's a more equitable approach to link that new development to the existing, the new transport infrastructure that you've put in. So if someone has a home or someone has a business that's located close to a piece of transport infrastructure, there's potentially a sort of democratic issue about, they weren't necessarily involved in the delivery of that infrastructure. They might benefit from a property uplift, a property price uplift, but they already lived close to that site. Whereas if you have a new piece of development that's been unlocked, and you can directly link that causality of the unlocking of the development to the new infrastructure, then the property that you've got is directly related to the introduction of the new infrastructure. So it's a balance between existing, were you there already, where the commercial premises and the residential sites there already, or are you unlocking an additional level of development? And if you're able to capture the benefits from that additionality, then that's, in our view, from the report we did, a more sort of equitable way of capturing the
So was that a yes or a no? Sorry, was that if you're a current resident and business, you should contribute? Is that a yes?
So, yes, I mean, yeah.
Okay. See, I'm trying to... You take HS2 as a very good example, run by politicians and bureaucrats that don't know what they're doing. Delay after delay after delay, significant amounts of money invested. And if you'd gone with that sort of model where residents and businesses had to contribute to that uplift, they'd be out of pocket for, well over a decade now? And not seeing that uplift, that business could have moved on by then. That resident could have moved out by then. So I've addressed that to you, John, but I see Tony's got his hand up. So do you want to...
Well, I think one of the many problems with HS2 is that for everybody who lobbies for it, the government pays for 100% of it, and that is a model that is doomed. Because far better, if I can take it, Crossrail, even though there were cost overruns and it was delivered late, in the end, London fare payers, taxpayers, SIL payers and everybody have contributed over half of the total of the resources that will be used were used to get it running. And that discipline of having local contributions and people having to think, is this the best use of the money locally, is a profoundly important one. And it applies to all projects, and that's why this kind of discussion is interesting, because we're talking about rationing public resources, rationing the taxpayers' money, rationing fair payers' money. And so, this is most important stuff, and I think it's axiomatic that London pays for at least in part for its own projects, as should Leeds and Manchester, by the way, for theirs, because it creates discipline in the way the money is used.
Well, I'm about to look like an idiot, Tony, because I'm about to go head-to-head with you on something that you said before. And it's never wise to go head-to-head with Professor Tony Travis.
Go for it.
Right, so given your train of thought, so what you've just used as an example is the entirety of the London tax base paying for half the scheme, right? Is that correct? Right.
Well, remember, I've said earlier, I'm in favour of I would be in favour here and there of premium fares, and if you'd asked me, I've implied this earlier, I think if the council tax and business rate system were regularly revalued and the money were retained locally, as my property value went up because Crossrail or Elizabeth Line arrived near my home, I would pay slightly more tax. At the moment, it's going into the capital value of the property. So I think I'm trying to tilt us partly towards users or beneficiaries pay, but partly accepting that there is a general good, which is why, coming back to Crossrail 2, people who've not benefited from the Elizabeth Line, who live in southwest and northeast London, would benefit if they got Crossrail 2, and over time, different parts of the city contribute to the city's general progress.
And I'm not arguing that point. I think the general tax base should pay for these major infrastructure updates. There's no argument about that. But using John's logic that local residents and businesses should pay for the land value capture, you gave a very good example earlier, where you said Farringdon and Bond Street did not see the benefits of that uplift in the surrounding area through the Elizabeth Line because you hadn't had the increase in development or blah, blah, blah. So that's my question to you.
Well, the taxpayer didn't see the benefit, because had there been substantial development at Farringdon, there was a bit at Tottenham Court Road, in fairness to Camden, and at Bond Street. Had there been more development there, and I'm not talking about skyscrapers, but higher levels of development, additions to the square footage of offices, that would have produced more money for the Treasury and business rates, because that's, in a sense, who gets that. If there had been domestic properties, well, that would have produced more money for the Treasury too, because in the end, that's a hermetically controlled system. But in a better system of local government finance, it would have produced more money for Islington Council and the mayor at one place, and Westminster City Council and the mayor at the other, going back to the Chair's point about the Development Corporation, where the capturing will have to be done by Section 106 and SIL. So I think in a better functioning, a properly functioning local government finance system, where infrastructure arrives, not only should those whose property values rise contribute, but secondly, there'd be an incentive for more development at sites such as this if the council and the mayor kept more of the money.
But going that approach then, you are taking a more, apologies if I've misunderstood, you're taking more of a general tax base approach rather than something that is hyper-localised, because going back to the point I made before, you know, I've yet to see a project ever, I've had a relatively, well, I don't think I'm middle-aged yet, but mentally, yes. Yeah, I won't say which colleagues have caused me to age miserably, so it's the passage of time overspends once again bureaucracy, politicians not getting these things right. Generally, where the private sector is far more efficient at running these schemes and developments and implementing this infrastructure. How then is it fair on a local level to ask a small to medium-sized business and residents to provide some of the burden for that cost?
Well, if their benefit, so if a new bus stop or a cycle lane or a tube stop or whatever it is arrives out, and the cycle lane was going to take us down a different
no, don't worry, okay. I won't go there.
But not in a bad way. I mean, but if new infrastructure arrives near your home or business and it raises the value of your home or the turnover of your business, reasonably, the tax system will capture that through council tax and business rate. It's just that local government doesn't capture it. It's all equalised away.
But then is it not fairer to do that towards the end of an infrastructure project rather than the beginning? Because, as I say, you could be asked to foot the bill if you're there, but it's not delivered 15 years later.
No, it's a very good point, and anticipation has risen. You know, we've seen enough evidence, and others along the table will know more about this than me. But even the anticipation of the Elizabeth line arriving led to investment and development in advance of it even opening. I'm pretty sure that's true, isn't it? So, you know, nobody's saying any one of these groups of beneficiaries should pay all of it, but inevitably they'll all pay some of it. And I think even, you know, businesses have slightly more of a visible say in the benefits that we're discussing here of new infrastructure than they do over, you know, Thames Water, a regulated private company which was not clearly very well regulated and has led to a situation where water bills are going to have to go up for a long time in order to try to catch up with failed investment. So at least here we're able to have a discussion about what is invested where and who benefits and who doesn't, and then a political decision can be made.
I feel like you've just come today to open cans of worms. You know, you've gone after the Treasury, Thames Water, you know, it's this. So on a final point, I want to use a very good example of the point I'm trying to make, because I just want to bottom out this point. So if you take Meridian Water in Enfield, right? So that's been a 15-year scheme, was meant to deliver 10,000 units. And I'll come on to why I'm mentioning it. You know, so far it's been about 300. Now, a brand new station was created for this scheme. So once again, 15 years later, so there's a big Tesco there, there's lots of residential surrounding the site, and an IKEA, which is now gone. And actually that helps the example. So therefore, all of these residential units, all of these businesses, you know, bigger businesses would have been asked to foot the bill earlier on. And I know I'm stressing this point, but for me, I'm just trying to, how do we get to an equitable solution? So, you know, what you're suggesting, you know, simplifying the system so we do get a greater contribution towards that land value from people that will benefit in the future, which inevitably they do, given your Elizabeth line example. But how, if you could do it in a way, how would it be the fairest?
So who would, well, I mean, in the end, politics will have to decide this. This is why we're having this discussion. But just going back to the Meridian Water problem, or as you've described the problem, what is it that you think, who's paying unfairly at the moment?
No, nobody.
I know you're supposed to ask me questions,
No.
but-
So it's the, I'm not going to get into the local stuff on it,
Okay,
because once again, we'll be here forever. But it's a matter of I'm saying if we went down the road of, right, so the Tesco, the IKEA, and all the residential units would have contributed to that uplift in land value, but yet still 15 years later, the infrastructure has been put in for the station, but the development's not been realised. Therefore, there isn't that additional return on investment because there aren't more trains running, because there aren't people living there.
Okay, no, it's a great question, and I suppose I'd have to say that, you know, we all love Tesco. Tesco have made a long-term investment, and they'll be expecting to get their money back in the long term if the shop's still open. Let's hope they do.
But not the residential units.
Well, the residential...
Or the IKEA would have paid and
I mean,
has
they'll have
already
made
moved
their
out.
investment on, you know, they'll have made a judicious investment on the assumption these extra units will be built. And if they're not being built, of course, that will then make them less likely to invest in future in future projects, because they'll be more wary and then try to get better commitments from the local planning authority. So, you know, do I want Tesco to have a profitable shop there? Yeah, absolutely. But they did make the investment having looked at the conditions on the ground, and that's how capitalism works.
Right, rather than going down the capitalism route. No, I love capitalism. Right, I'll leave it there, but thank you all very much for your responses. Yeah.
I think I'm going to insert a timely plug for tomorrow's meeting, where we are looking at delivery of projects, and some of the international comparisons of what can be built, how quickly and at what cost, frankly, are quite astonishing. I'm sure we hopefully will learn a great deal about how all of those problems can be alleviated by getting it done quicker and for less. But first, Assemblymember Polanski.
I thought I was a timely plug for capitalism. I was like, thanks, Neil. Maurice, we've spoken a lot about land value capture, and I think you've probably touched on some of the questions I've got to ask you. So just say if it's any additional. The first question is, we've understandably talked a lot about 106 and SIL money. How effective are these as mechanisms for capturing the increase in land value?
I think the answer is they're simultaneously some of the most effective land value capture mechanisms that we've had in the UK over a sustained period of time, and there's also good evidence that they could be doing considerably better. It also depends what your objective is. If your objective is to make a smooth process for development in all situations, certainly Section 106 is not necessarily the best way of doing that. But if your objective is to capture as much land value capture as you could on any given site, then Section 106 offers you a flexibility where you can do what London does, which is ask for a pretty high percentage of affordable housing to be delivered and then have flexibility in negotiation. So there's a trade-off in sort of how your mechanisms work and what you might be achieving. Our modelling took a broad-based look at the whole of the UK. And we estimated the cost of doing a large-scale greenfield development in any given place, and we estimated the potential market value of an 100% market value development in any given place. And because it's across the whole of the country and it's a local authority level broadly, it's when you get down to the specifics of each site, the accuracy of the estimations are they're sort of there and thereabouts at a sort of regional level. And what we found was in large parts of the country, the difference between costs and revenues is not substantial, such that you would never expect a land value capture mechanism of any kind, be it Section 106 or Public Land Assembly or whatever, to give you substantial revenues towards paying for infrastructure or whatever, or affordable housing. And therefore, the fact that we don't see substantial amounts of affordable housing being built in new developments in Newcastle is not a surprise, and it doesn't. I don't think we should be grasping for new mechanisms to try and solve that problem, because there isn't a problem to be grasped. But our evidence also suggests that there is considerable scope for improvement on land value capture in and around London, in and around the Greater South East, in more valuable locations, where at least if our cost modelling is decent, then we can sort of backwards work out that landowners are getting a substantial share of the pie, and if you're trying to incentivise development, that might be what's required to bring that land forward, to get that landowner to say, oh, hey, I'll sell you this land. But if what you're trying to do is maximise revenues from land value capture, there is a gap that you could close, if that makes sense. In and around the Greater South East, we think there's a 40%-ish and potentially more in some locations around London, improvement to be made on what's coming forward. But of course, that also, like how much you get through land value capture depends on how much development you do. So if you were to release more land for development and keep the level of land value capture you're doing on any given site, you would increase your quantum of land value capture even without changing the mechanism or the amount of land value capture you get on any given development, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. And just building on that, I think it comes back to this conversation Tony was having earlier with Alex, but how much is that already captured through corporation tax, stamp duty, etc.?
I don't have an estimate. So there's two ways of kind of estimate how effective existing mechanisms are. One is to try and add up the sum of all of the taxes, etc. And Tom Aubrey did a paper back in 2016-17, which did a decent job of doing that. The other way of doing it is how we've done it. So estimate how much stuff costs to make, how much land you could buy it for, what existing use values are, and then that gap. Mine and Tom Aubrey's paper kind of get each other's answer, if that makes sense. But you'd have to look at his paper on how much you get from those other revenue sources.
Thank you. And what are the potential risks or downsides of land value capture?
Well, if you took a public-led land assembly approach, where you are assembling land for less than the market would otherwise buy it, which isn't necessarily what so not all public land assembly does do that or is able to do that in all circumstances, but in the circumstances where the current legislation and the Levelling Up Act in 2023 now enable you to buy land at existing use value, the potential problem with that is that you interrupt what is going on in the market otherwise in other sites. So let's say you were a developer and you'd lined up this development and you had every intention to develop it, but then there is now this new risk that the state be it local authority or GLA, is going to go and buy your land off you for less. That risk then impedes any of that activity, if that makes sense. So you'd be less likely to make those investments to try and work out whether or not a development is worth doing, because you face a sort of an existential risk through of the state buying your land off you for less money, which is why it's important to dovetail both land assembly mechanisms with planning, because through planning you can go, well, we're going to do it here and we're not going to do it here, and to do it with a really long time horizon rather than one which introduces risk over a kind of shorter time scale that lots of developers and house builders are having to think to get their money.
Thank you. And Tony, coming to you finally, what else should be funded using land value capture, and how should this be prioritised other than transport, I mean?
Well, as I've sort of said in the matter of Euston, I think, by the way, when I was talking about 85-storey towers as a stylised idea, I didn't want to give Assembly Member Clark and bad dreams, but, I mean, just sort of, I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying, this discussion, I mean, the way land value capture works is that it effectively incentivises ever more development. And it's supposed to do that at some level. The more generous your planning permission, the more money the public sector can earn from the development. So that, I think, then puts pressure back on town halls and city hall to decide with individual developments what is the infrastructure they want. Because if you want social and affordable housing, which is more difficult to deliver in this way, unless you're delivering alongside it expensive, high-value homes, and that always produces a separate complication. So I think it's up to local government and City Hall to think about what's the best we can get out of this site in terms of delivering land value capture, but also getting socially desirable infrastructure, or what individuals would think socially desirable infrastructure. And that, again, then leads to a trade-off with the scale of the development. So going back to Battersea Nine Elms, the reason there's so many towers and so much development there is in part because it had to be like that in order to pay for the tube station and the tube line, tube stations and the tube line. And, in a different world, you could have had a park at Battersea and Nine Elms, and the government could have paid for rebuilding the power station for several £billion. But they went the other way. They went down the let's do it through land value capture and capturing tax yield way. And so, to answer your question directly, I think it's up to the sophistication of those in local government to make sure they get what, in their own terms, and it's political, is the right mixture of infrastructure and assets out of a particular development.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Before we move on, I'm trying to try and capture some possible conclusions or recommendations that we might make. You mentioned earlier, Tony, you mentioned a couple of times about, for example, the Battersea scheme, the Crossrail scheme. These involved some elements of the things we've been talking about today, but each one was a kind of bespoke, special, pristine, created just for this one-off, unique moment, and evidently involved a great deal of negotiation to get there. Should I then infer from that, or we as a committee infer from that, that perhaps if there were a more generalised mechanism that existed, that would make life easier, and if so, what might that look like?
Well, the straight answer is yes, there should be. I mean, if we go back, I mentioned the Victoria line, Jubilee line extension, DLR from its inception, the other way around actually, then the Elizabeth line, Crossrail 1. Each one of those was completely differently delivered in terms of the pressures that built up for it and then the decision. So if we take the start of the DLR, it was because, let's go for it directly. Mrs. Thatcher wanted to develop Docklands. She created up the LDDC and agreed to building this short, relatively low-cost stretch of light railway, not quite onto the tube, but nearly onto the tube at one end and down to Island Gardens at the other. And, that was the beginning of that, but that was very much a one-off, and they almost all are a one-off. So, so I think, yes, it would be far better for London, given its propensity to deliver these projects, if the government were to make it easier for TfL, and it might not only be for transport, but certainly with transport, to say, look, here's a TIF model that we can enact at, Old Oak, or we can enact at Euston, and we don't have to spend years and years and years of negotiating it with the Treasury every single time.
Okay. And, are there other countries, I don't know if anyone, perhaps Maurice, are there sort of somewhat off-the-shelf models, or is it such a complicated business that actually it's hard to come up with a standard approach?
I think there's kind of two directions. Like Tony said, you could have a stock way of doing a particular type of land value capture. And then you could take that even further and say, oh, well, the only land value capture mechanism we're going to replace SIL and Section 106 with an infrastructure levy, for example, or a flat development charge on all development. I think examples where you go for only that flat charge is you have to set it at a minimum, because otherwise you preclude a lot of development which is viability challenged from ever happening, and then that loses potential to get on other places. And so that always leaves you in a situation where either you're getting less from a land value capture point of view than you could, or you are still having to have those other things which tack on in different situations. So I think, like, certainly what Tony was saying about, you know, if you have one given mechanism and we know how it could work and we know we should be able to cookie cutter that and use it. And I think, you know, the government's New Towns programme is going to be a lesson in learning how to do large-scale land assembly again, if they go down that route. And then that will help that be used as a model in a range of different situations. But I think there's also a level of inevitability about any given project being different and therefore having different potentials and different requirements. And there's no way you can just go, okay, we're going to have a flat tax and get rid of that, if that makes sense.
And in terms of risk, I think Assemblyman Plansky did ask about risk, but I think another risk that we've not quite covered, or, well, perhaps between them, as Assemblyman Plansky and George, you sort of covered this, but what happens if you have a plan that involves creating some land value capture, borrowing against that, let's say, £2.5 billion to fund a project which is expected to cost £2.5 billion, then it costs £3.5 billion. Obviously, somebody's got to find the extra £1 billion or the whole project stalls. Are there ways of capturing that or dealing with that? I don't know whether that's Manish or leaning forward. Does TfL have any experience of cost overruns on major projects?
That would be a surprise. No, but I think it's a fair question. And I think without getting into numbers, that's a debate we are internally having on DLR as well, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. And I think the way to deal with that is that when you plan the project, you have to put enough contingencies for it, because you have to plan for, look, what if things go wrong? And the project should always be, you proceed with the project once once you have dealt with a very substantial number of scenarios where if something goes wrong, how will you deal with that? And build that cushion and contingency into that. So hopefully, when you actually deliver the project, you can deliver it to time, to budget, and therefore not use the contingency, or probably use a bit of contingency, but have some more cushion left over. Now, it's fair to say things can go substantially wrong so that your contingency gets eaten up. It's very rare that you don't see it ahead of time. So it gives you, if the project starts going wrong, you will know very early something has gone wrong. So, for example, your scope could be wrong, you could be very, very wrong on the timing, etc. And I think my only advice is that at that point of time, you just have to start really thinking very hard ahead of time to see how you will deal with a crisis that's about to hit you after a year or so. It's very rare that you discover projects have gone wrong at the last moment.
Okay. I don't see any hands up. So in that case, if we move on to section, the bit I suppose we haven't really covered, government support for London infrastructure. Assembly Member Harani.
Thank you, Chair. And just on that, in terms of government support for London's infrastructure, so we've spoken about all the kind of priority projects for TfL. So, Manish, what's the approach at the moment, given the wish list that we have on those growth projects, but and the fact that we don't really have that off-the-shelf template, if you like, for funding these projects at the moment? It sounds like you're getting some progress on the DLR to Thamesmead on a completely separate negotiation from what we've seen. Is it still going by the case-by-case basis with government on those discussions?
So on the larger schemes, the answer is yes. On the smaller schemes, and so as I mentioned, that we have a large budget, and the funding settlement with government, it's an overall funding settlement. The government is not micromanaging where we invest that money. That's up to TfL.
Okay.
And there's a very substantial pot of cash we have. We generate a lot of, operational surplus. We generate some operational surplus as well. So some of the decisions, or most of the decisions, remain with TfL. On the larger growth schemes, they are definitely outside the funding envelope, and on those, we expect to do more bilateral arrangements. Now, I think it's fair to say how we get to a bilateral arrangement, the principles of that remain largely unchanged. So because we would like to get how much money can we generate as TfL to fund the project, how much additional support we might need from government, what we can generate from land sources, LBC, etc. So the principles remain largely the same for all schemes. But ultimately, the way we have to look at it is that if we were to go ahead with the scheme, what scale of support will we need from government so that TfL's overall finances are not adversely impacted?
Okay.
I think we do have to consider that very carefully so that we can actually keep funding our normal course of business from the funding that is available to us, both in terms of external debt from various sources and from our internal cash generation.
Okay. And I just want to probe on something that Tony mentioned about, the ideal world where land value goes up because of as a result of an infrastructure project, and ideally that could be captured in council tax and business rates. But in such a system, how do you envisage people on low incomes being protected from that? Imagine in a place like London, you'll have lots of families that are capital rich but have a very low income, especially looking at communities that may have bought properties at very low prices in 70s, 80s, 90s.
I mean, it's a fair point. It's a very good point. If we had, as we do with our incomes, and it's not unimaginable to do this, if we hadn't had successive governments not revaluing council tax since 1991, in a better world, we could have council tax valuation that happened every year. It's not impossible these days. And that would mean that the change from year to year would be limited. And for homes, of course, that were affected by significant changes in their council tax bills, if it came to that, or businesses, business rate bills, certainly for council tax, there would be most boroughs, all boroughs, have varying degrees of protection for council tax for individuals households on low income, to protect them from excessive council tax bills, than they would if the bills went up, to some degree be protected by those mechanisms. But again, if you think about the alternative mechanism, which is the one we've got now, which is to have council tax based on 1991 relative values, nobody thinks that makes sense. So we'd have to live with it. But I think if you had regular revaluations, the impact would be far less severe than if we ever had one now, which would be after a generation.
Okay. Maurice, you want to come in?
Yeah, just on council tax, if thinking about a world where some major council tax reform happens, you could, because it's a locally based tax, you needn't do the revaluation or the rebanding on a national level as it currently is now. You could do it on a borough by borough or on a city-wide basis, such that you could have a scenario, which Centre for Cities has done the modelling for, where 2/3 of people in a given local authority would be able to experience a tax cut, because you have a situation where you can make the wealthier people in a given local authority pay more, whereas currently it's a regressive tax. So there are ways of getting around the fact that everybody in London, if you revalued across the whole country, would see a substantial increase in council tax.
Good. So, Professor Tony Travers, I'm going to ask about the Treasury's Green Book, because you've spoken at length about the Treasury in general, but looking at the Green Book, which is due to be updated and published again in January 2026, what do you feel are the long-term implications for London from the revision?
Well, I suspect others, my expert witnesses will have more to say will know more about this than I do. Based broadly, it is felt, particularly outside London, that the current or the previous Green Book arrangements privilege London and the South East because their value cost-benefit calculations have tended to suggest that infrastructure investments will make higher returns or better benefit to cost ratios if they're undertaken in London and the South East than in the rest of the country. Now, the government wants to move away from that. I think they'll still be guided by that idea, but towards one where longer-term regeneration or social value is taken into account. And again, as with so many of the things we've discussed this morning, there's a political, I don't mean a party, but it's just a political angle to this. But the further you move away from the Green Book, the more you risk getting to the point of saying, we're also almost willfully going to invest in projects that don't make any return over time. So you have to be very careful how far you go down that route. But I think that's the issue that the reform, or the new approach, if it is to be radically different, the Green Book, that's the issue from London's point of view. Relatively, projects here would be less attractive than they have been in the past, other things being equal.
John, did you have anything to add on the Green Book?
Not really, no. I mean, I think as Tony said, I think the reform of the Green Book is probably overdue. I think there are historical versions of the analysis of the Green Book that's looked at benefit cost ratios for projects have looked at quite narrow definitions over previous years. I think if you can build in, looking away from the kind of distribution or who gets what, London gets more than other cities, if you can build in things like that social value equation into Green Book Treasury analysis of it's not just moving people around from transport projects, but it's those wider benefits that you unlock, education, attainment, health outcomes, benefits for small businesses, then you get to a better and more full understanding of the benefit cost ratios for projects. So that's potentially something we would recommend in terms of Green Book reform.
Okay. And Manish and Lucinda, how are you adapting your approach as a result of this and taking into account that question about social value? Now, just thinking about the projects that are a priority for TfL, such as West London Orbital and the DLR extension to Thamesmead and the Bakerloo line extension and the new fleet that you're looking for investment. Actually, a lot of these projects are serving a lot of the outer London areas where income tends to be lower than central. Are you adapting your approach when it comes to making that case now to government on this?
The short answer is yes, and DLR Thamesmead is a perfect example. So Thamesmead as a region is, again, an outer borough. It's one of the largest brownfield sites for development. And there's a plan to do 30,000 houses, including a lot of social housing as well. So I think the approach is definitely adapted to the requirements, where we are looking at, pretty much all the factors, including supply chain, how are we actually developing a part of London which needs some attention to some extent. So our approach is definitely geared in that direction. I think linking it back to the Green Book, it's not very clear what changes will be made. But I think for me, the question is not what changes are being made, but the question is how decisions get made after that. And I think the key point I would make is that if this leads to a bit of a, and this is the closest I'm going to get to making a political comment, apologies for that, but I think if it gets to a London versus regional divide, I think that would be my biggest fear. Because ultimately, it's not about London versus the rest. It's all about collectively, as this country, where should we be investing for growth? And therefore, it's got to be both London and the regions, not London versus the regions.
Lucinda?
Yeah, just a couple of further reflections. In relation to the Green Book, we are hopeful that it will mean that there is more account taken of place-based objectives and transformational change, which has been difficult traditionally to take account of. And the kinds of projects we're talking about that are so integrated with housing delivery, sustainable communities, kind of placemaking, kind of etc., and unlocking new parts of London, kind of in some cases, and in other cases like West London Orbital, supporting the transformation of town centres and kind of really changing the kind of sense of connectivity and the perceived kind of viability of investment in those areas. So we are hopeful that it will take a bit more account of that. Just more broadly on business cases, particularly when it comes to transport investment, it has tended to be a struggle sometimes to make the case for growth and the localised benefits when that set aside the kind of cumulative impact of value of time. So Beam Park Station has been a classic example where the benefits of the housing delivery and the local impacts of how that transforms what you can do in that area and how connected that is has been kind of fought against. DfT have taken a view that the impact of existing travellers having to stop at an extra to new stop has been a disadvantage, and so those two can sometimes kind of weigh against each other. So we are trying to continue to make the case for those growth and place-based dimensions.
Okay, and obviously, so the Mayor commented publicly about the previous, or the most recent spending review being disappointing given the lack of new capital infrastructure, funding for new capital infrastructure projects for as far as TfL and Transport Network are concerned. But at the same time, if you look at the financial envelope, the financial envelope for capital spending from the government has gone up by £120 billion in that period up to 2029, 2030. So although the Green Book may have implications in terms of more projects being funded outside, do you still hold the optimism that the actual financial envelope has increased significantly and that could have benefits? We may get less as a percentage maybe than we used to, but the total number that's available for funding for projects across the country has increased. What's your take on how that balance is?
So I think we need to be conscious that the envelope of 120 billion includes a very substantial number for High Speed 2, which distorts the number in entirety. So if you take that aside, I mean, you have a public statements, which is we would always have preferred more money. I think, I mean, obviously, going back to the old question of, look, I mean, we definitely believe there's a number of schemes which generate a substantial economic value for London, and we would love to deliver them. So I think in that context, yes, it was a good settlement for us because it allows us to do the basics, but we could always do more.
Sorry, final question for Tony, because of the questions or the answers you've given in relation to the Treasury, do you see it as an institutional issue with the Treasury or a political issue, capital P?
Well, there's a book to be written on that one too, isn't there? I mean, the thing is that it's a bit of both. I'm afraid it's previous government and this government, they may have many things that are different, but one thing they have that is similar is an approach towards what the former government called levelling up. But the current government's going down very much the same policy in rather the same way. And that is a political decision. Defend politics. Politicians are legitimately allowed to make such decisions, and equally other politicians to argue back. I think on the Treasury, on the question of the Treasury as such, which is always there, there are an array of behavioural traits in the Treasury that are, let's put it kindly again, hard fully to align or fully to understand in terms of, a rational approach to local public policy. And one we haven't touched on this morning, but it's sort of come up again and again. We haven't quite made this point. I mean, I think that, a lot of the projects we're discussing require borrowing. And the Treasury finds it hard to differentiate between borrowing to build an asset that will produce economic growth in the future and borrowing to service the national debt. Okay? And they are very different things. But when it comes to borrowing, borrowing is borrowing is borrowing. So I think, making the case that this particular investment will, we talked about transport this morning, improve the lives of people, drive up GDP, make business more successful, is a better use of borrowing than other potential uses of borrowing. It might, to improve housing standards will be a better use than other things one might do with borrowed money. So this is a different kind of borrowing. This is like borrowing, going back to the point that was made earlier, borrowing to buy a home rather than what kind of feckless borrowing could I personally describe? But you can see what I mean. Something that is not going to give you an asset that works for you in the long term. Better than a credit card.
Borrowing to go on
credit
holiday.
Card bill
How
on
about
phone.
that? Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. Well, we've all talked about growth, and we all agree that growth is absolutely vital. And I'm thrilled to bits that I agree with Professor Tony Travers that the Treasury does lack, in my view, vision, and it lacks creativity. And you're kindly, I'm not, because this is affecting all of us very badly. And if they actually want growth, the way they're going around it, it has to leave us all wondering what on earth they are doing. But if I go to the questions that I'm supposed to be asking, Manish, what more can the government do to support London and TfL to access alternative sources of funding for infrastructure?
Thank you. So I think in addition to the growth schemes that we have talked about, a few other areas where I think TfL can be helped a lot is there is a number of other pots of cash or pots of funding available, which are available largely across the UK. So things like Structures Fund, which is £1 billion fund to repair major structures on road networks. So there's a little line in the funding settlement in the CSR letter which says that TfL will have no access to other funds available across government, which is something we are actually having a discussion on. So we think that given that some of these funding pots are available uniformly across the UK, I think us to have access to these funds on an equal basis is important. So things like the Structures Fund, there's a number of green funds that the government had before. So things like Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, from where we have taken about 18 million for decarbonisation of our scheme, of our buildings, depots, an Eastern Depot, for example. There is the Housing Infrastructure Fund that's been, there's a 39 billion allocation to MHCLG for housing. So there's a number of other pots of cash which, other parts of UK can access on a case-by-case basis. And we are quite keen that some of those are accessible to TfL.
Sorry, did you say that we're not allowed to go for those funds?
So we are trying to get details on that. If you look at our CSR letter, it basically says that there are certain pots of cash that would not be available to London beyond the settlement.
So the first question is why? So
exactly.
Somebody's asked why.
So
what answer?
So we are getting clarities on those right now. So we don't have clarity in all fairness, and we are basically making a case that we should have access to additional funding, which is available to every other part of UK as well.
And has the Mayor actually asked why?
I'm sure that's been asked why. I don't know what the response is, but we have asked the question.
And when do we hope to have an answer as to why we're being treated so unfairly to the rest of the country?
I don't have an answer to that, Susan.
When are we hoping for an answer?
We are definitely hoping for an answer. So that's definitely on our radar to check. Additional areas where we could help is, for example, for ZEVs. We have nearly 80 depots in London, and to achieve our zero emission buses target, each of those depots have to be electrified. And as you know, there's a fairly substantial issue right now in the UK around getting power connections. So that's one area where, again, help from government in some form in just accelerating the connectivity of infrastructure is going to be quite helpful.
Can you confirm, are we the only area in the country that has been told that they cannot have access to other funding?
We will need to come back on that. I am not sure what other funding letters have said. We were looking at our funding letter, and that's what basically had said, we were told.
Can you throw any light on this, Professor?
The government, I'm not answering a precisely transport question here. There are certainly new funding pots that have emerged from the government, which for sort of neighbourhoods and so on, which London is not going to benefit from. But you're not going to like this, but the Towns Fund under the previous government, London wasn't allowed to get money from that either. So there's a sort of a number of funding streams which London either isn't allowed or doesn't get any money from, particularly to do with local regeneration, or where London gets less per capita than others. And it is, again, it's an artefact of this bipartisan policy which sees London as less in need. So they think London neighbourhoods are less in need of funding of this kind than neighbourhoods in the rest of the country, by implication.
Two wrongs don't make a right, though, do they?
They don't.
So I go back to saying we need to know why London isn't allowed this. We are the powerhouse of the country, as the Mayor is always telling us, and it would look like we're being treated very unfairly. So would you be able to write to the committee and let us know when you get an answer as to why we're not allowed that? And have you given them a deadline to find out why we're not allowed, the same as the rest of the country?
No, we have not given them a deadline. It's conversations with the DfT.
Are you tempted to give them a deadline?
I'm not too sure that will work, but I think in the scheme of, I think it's a fair question to ask, Susan. So it's something that we are engaging with the DfT on.
Okay, well, I won't get an answer because I never do from the Mayor, but I will be asking the Mayor why we are not getting the same privileges, if you like, the rest of the country. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. We do sometimes get answers, but not necessarily to the question that we asked. Just quickly on that, is TfL still lobbying for vehicle excise duty for London-registered vehicles? That was an ask over a long time, certainly under the previous government. I'm trying not to be too political, but is that ask still there?
I'm not too sure, Neil. I don't know. I will have to... do you know?
Yeah, I don't know the latest. It was some years ago, kind of pre-COVID. I was aware that we were kind of lobbying.
I've only been an Assembly member post-COVID,
so it was.
So in my memory we've definitely been repeatedly asking.
Can we come back to you on that, because it definitely was. We were asking, weren't we, for access to some element of VED that was raised in kind of paid within London.
Yeah, it's about half a billion pounds rather.
To help support, because we made the case that kind of for public transport, there's fares revenues and other kind of sources for kind of the maintenance and support for streets and roads. There wasn't. If we come back to you specifically on that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. This is a question probably for Tony, I imagine. This is more policy related. We've been talking a lot about funding and what the government can do to access alternative funding mechanisms. I suppose the other question, the other part of the equation is what legislative levers can they pull? What more can they do to help in terms of things like planning? So, I mean, in our briefing, we've got the stuff about the Bakerloo extension. There's a Grampian clause which prevents a Grampian condition, apparently, which effectively says that 20,000 homes can't be started can't be built until the work on the extension starts. 10,000 homes are actively prevented from being built until it's completed. So do we have the balance right in terms of protections, in terms of planning, but the need to deliver infrastructure?
I may not be able to give a very coherent answer to this because...
It wasn't a very coherent question.
No, but I didn't mean that. But I mean, I'm just... because clearly the reduction in housing starts and the the paradox, which, others along this table will know more about than I do, this paradox that we live in a city with a chronic housing shortage where governments of all major parties want to build more housing, and yet somehow the market is so unable to deliver, it can't deliver. So, it is a terrible paradox, and yet on the business side, industrial and commercial property, that market appears to work remarkably well inside the same planning system. Discuss. So I think that, and the issue of all the things we've been talking about today, which is trying to use land value capture, funding mechanisms variously, to deliver better transport infrastructure relatively swiftly if the government will allow it, then comes up against the challenge of the fact that the viability of many housing developments just doesn't stack up for a whole range of other reasons that are nothing to do with this and have to do with things that are well beyond my known world, to do with, you know, regulations about staircases and dual aspect windows and things I've heard about elsewhere. And that leads us over this curiously paradoxical world that delivering more transport infrastructure through land value capture then comes up against this new constraint, which is the viability of developments. But as I say, I suspect my colleagues along this table will know more about that than I do.
Yeah, listen.
Yeah, I can give a bit more detail on the BLE specifically. So yes, we have kind of imposed a Grampian condition, kind of shorthand for. We have identified what level of development is supportable currently with the existing transport infrastructure and with improvements in buses, which are the focus in the interim. Beyond that, the capacity just isn't there. So we're working and have been working closely with the borough for a long time to try to manage that. It's always a very careful balance, and they are not imposed lightly, because we want more homes. We don't want to prevent them coming forward. But if the development is to be sustainable, that people are going to be able to travel to and from there, we do need to look at that capacity. We also kind of are making the case, I mean, we have made the case very strongly that the BLE is necessary to unlock that level of growth. One thing I would say, though, is it's not until the BLE is delivered. It's until there's some surety that it's a contract let or it's a TWA process. So it's when there is some assurance that the project will be proceeding. That's very deliberately done, so we can unlock those homes as soon as kind of possible when we've got that confidence that the transport infrastructure is there.
Sorry, our briefing, 10,500 are subject to a Grampian condition which prevents their construction until the BLE is delivered. So that's our briefing, which is a bit chonky. But isn't there this case that we need to have? I mean, there is a desperate need for housing, and I appreciate fully the constraints on infrastructure locally, but there is that trade-off, and and we're spending millions going into temporary accommodation for people, which could be going into building the infrastructure if we could build the houses.
So absolutely, we are keeping it continually under review, and whether we are reaching the cap. We haven't reached the cap yet. There are permissions in place, but because of issues around fire safety regulation and lots of other issues, they're not actually kind of delivered. So kind of there is still headroom to deliver them. At the moment, there are other kind of challenges preventing that coming forward rather than the Grampian, but we are constantly monitoring and reviewing it, because we do, as I say, it is always a very, very careful balance, and kind of it is not done lightly.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. We now move on to our final section for this morning, which is ominously titled When Public-Private Finance Goes Wrong. Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think my question initially, I think it will be Professor Travers. I think TfL, I'd like to hear your views as well. So obviously today we've been talking about funding major capital projects, but we can't ignore that we did do public-private partnership for the underground in slightly different circumstances during the 2000s. Didn't entirely cover ourselves in glory, I think it's fair to say. So I think it's worth asking, what are the key factors that meant that version of PPP failed, and what are the lessons that can be learned if we're thinking about it again?
Well, at its shortest, obviously the fact that both the PPP for the London Underground heavily wished on the first mayor of London, who opposed it, by the then government, the then Labour government, was badly constructed, unlikely to ever to have worked, and didn't. PFI, which was used in parallel, and that had started actually under the previous Conservative government, that went to the bad because in the end, at its simplest, those negotiating these long contracts for schools and hospitals had less information and, to put it even more brutally, less of a profit motive than the people, their counterparties, who were signing the deals. There's a very good National Audit Office report on that, which effectively explains all of this in detail. But that doesn't mean it couldn't work if it was properly constructed. I mean, PFIs work all over the world. They're used in Britain, though they're not called that quite the same way now. So one in which the deal worked better for the public sector over whatever the period of the project than the earlier ones, and where there was not an enormous amount of renegotiating of borrowing costs and all the other things that led to massive abstraction of benefit. So I personally can't see why PFI couldn't be revived, providing what the public sector gets back is good value for money compared with the long-term amount of money it puts in.
Thanks. Manish.
Thank you. So I think despite the early experience on some of the PPP contracts that TfL signed up, I think I would say overall there's nothing inherently wrong with the idea. And if used correctly, it can actually deliver some fantastic results. And I think it's fair to say Silvertown PFI, we have just recently completed construction. It's a PFI scheme, and we are quite happy with the way it has gone. You know, it's been successfully delivered to time. Any risks that were transferred to the contractor, it's to their account, and we basically get a project, you know, to our expectations, to our budget, and with a very clearly defined payment over a period of time. So that's a good example. I think there is another example where we have done a concession where we have transferred substantial risk. So if you look at the 4G, 5G concession, so all the telecom infrastructure on the underground, where mobile network, where mobile telephony, emergency services network, fiber, etc., is being done completely by the private sector called Boldyn Communications. That's nearly about £1 billion of investment being undertaken by the private sector entirely at their own risk, which, you know, we could not have done ourselves. You know, it's so I think these are good examples where a defined degree of risk has been transferred, where good results have been produced, and insulating TfL from the risk, but getting a real service. I think the lessons, I would say, from the PPP infrastructure maintenance terminations was, as Professor Travers rightly said, it was probably too much of a gaze in the future on what our long-term maintenance requirements will be. You know, it was trying to outsource maintenance and anticipating our requirements for the next 30 years, whereas the network is run by us. And those were almost destined to fail. And there's a few other examples which have failed around the same time. So if you look at Birmingham Highways Maintenance PFI, that's been a real problem as well for very similar reasons. There was a Manchester Waste PFI contract that was terminated about 7, 8 years back. Again, for largely the same reasons, where in that case, again, there was an expectation that you would define the quality of waste and the calorific value of waste for 30 years. So I think there were reasons why those failed, but at the same time, there's hundreds which have been very successful. So I think, so therefore, our approach is quite balanced, which is, if in the right circumstances we believe it can deliver value for money, we will absolutely look at that. If we believe that we can't get the risk allocation correctly, we can't really define the boundaries around what the project will deliver, then actually we would not be able to do that. I think another good example is our Elizabeth Line trains. They're actually privately owned and financed, and that works absolutely fine. So I think it's, again, it's I don't think one size fits all. So it's more about horses for courses.
Just the ability to be able to define exactly what you're giving up, effectively the element of control, and of course the two touch wood, the two projects you outline, of course, are still going on effectively, or they may have. I mean, obviously, so, but there's no indication that there's any concerns about delivery of those.
I can give one more example of a project which is, again, not very widely known, but it's actually nearly at the end of a concession life. So, I mean, concessions and PPPs are very widely used across infrastructure. So one of the most unknown concessions in the UK is Luton Airport. So Luton Airport is the only airport in the UK which is still owned by the public sector, the council, but it is entirely run on the concession. The concession was let out in 1998, and it goes up to 2031. The entire expansion of the airport has been completely funded by the private sector over the last 20, and it's stood the test of time for nearly 27 years now.
Okay, thanks. Might be slightly out of our area of expertise there, both being Luton and an airport, but thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much. Manish, did you say earlier that the TfL through the grant has now can't access the public decarbonisation scheme?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, you said they've lost access now to the public sector decarbonisation scheme.
No, actually, from what I understand, so a number of funds that the government previously had for green schemes have now been formally withdrawn. But in addition, the point I was making was that as part of our letter, we are prevented from accessing further funds where they were available.
Doesn't that have pretty serious consequences for our carbon budget?
No, because I think we still have the ability to finance from our own balance sheet everything, right? So, for example, all the ZEBs that we have already funded, which is about approximately 3,000 by the end of this year, we have not accessed funding from any of the other pots. They have all been funded primarily through TfL. And the way those work, for example, is that, so as you know, all the buses in the UK, in London, are owned by operators. They're not owned by TfL. But TfL effectively pays for it through operational payments, through tender contracts that we actually let out to private sector operators. And we actually do specify that we want ZEB buses. And therefore, those are basically paid for by TfL. So they have not really been taken benefit of some of the green funding. But if that was available, obviously it's always beneficial.
And sorry, just to check my understanding, there was no kind of future projected pots of money that were coming from this public sector decarbonisation fund that we now don't have.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
understood.
So to give you a reference point, many of the other mayor authorities across the UK, they have something called CRSTS, which is City Region Transport Sustainable Transport Fund. So that's the funding under which they have a fairly long-term settlement, and they can use a lot of that money to basically buy and invest into zero-emission buses.
Thank you. Moving back to the public-private finance, so there's a few schemes that we've bought ourselves out of and effectively saved money in the process. How have we funded that, and would it not have been better just to have done that in the first place?
So all the schemes that we have bought back, obviously the last scheme that was bought back was a while back, but typically the way we would buy a scheme back is we would borrow money on our balance sheet and use that to repay or pay out the concessionaire. That's largely what we would do. So to give you an example, when we actually bought back the PPP maintenance companies, Infracos, in late around 2009, 2010, there was a company called JNP, which was for Jubilee Line, Northern Line, and Piccadilly Line. The way we bought that out was that we basically acquired the equity in those companies on what we call a solvent equity purchase. So it was basically a market transaction. And along with that, all the debt that was on the balance sheet of the company on that day basically transferred to TfL. And over time, TfL basically repaid that loan. So that's typically what you do. Anytime you terminate, you will basically end up acquiring, assuming it's a bilateral transaction, assuming it's not a termination for poor quality performance, assuming it's a termination, what we call termination for convenience, you will basically acquire the debt of the company and borrow it on our balance sheet. That's what we would have to do.
Referring to Tony's answer early on, which I absolutely agree with, there's a big difference between borrowing to fund unfunded tax cuts, which obviously isn't in the mayor's purview, and borrowing for capital infrastructure. Would it have not made sense just to have done this in the first place rather than going to a...
So the answer is yes and no. So as I mentioned earlier, that in certain circumstances, I think having a private sector operator deliver a certain bit is actually quite useful. So I use the example of the telecom infrastructure. You know, that's a concession which is being completely funded and delivered by the private sector. It's fairly deep capability of telecom infrastructure, which, you know, TfL has a lot of capability, but it definitely cannot deliver all of that. It also takes management bandwidth. So I think in that case, there's a benefit to having that being delivered by the private sector. So I think we would always make the decision on what feels right at that point in time for every project. And is the partnership working? So many of the terminations have either been done because the project has not delivered what we expected to deliver, or it actually hasn't delivered, or the partnership hasn't worked, you know. Because if you ultimately these are partnerships, and if the partnership does not work, then you might have to find a way to get out of it over time, as opposed to live with it. So I think you have to really look at circumstances for each situation.
Thank you. Tony, did you want to come in there? No. Oh, sorry.
I'm just sitting forward. But
oh, that's okay. I have a question for you anyway, for you to come in. It's my final question. So Ken Livingstone talked about borrowing off future fares at one point when he was avoiding the public-private. Is there any evidence that that can work, and is it something that we should be looking at more?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of the Crossrail deal was borrowing against the fares that it would generate, and I think that, you know, the idea of borrowing against future revenue streams is one that works for business and the public sector everywhere. So I think so new projects that will produce revenue streams, be they by fares or by tolls. I mean, you know, as I said earlier, I think that here and there, tolling new, you know, not suggesting tolling Hammersmith Bridge, but it's an interesting thought experiment. If no other way can be found of getting it over the line, you know, would a 20-year toll be better than it never opening again? You know, just a thought. So I think anything that produces a revenue stream is inherently capable of being turned into an opportunity to borrow money against that in order to invest today to produce an asset. So you know this, I mean, an asset that will then be there for 100 or 200 years.
Well said. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Assembly Member Georgiou.
Tony. So on the exchange you just had with my colleague from the Greens, obviously we have a more recent example of not just Ken's on the Underground, but the Silvertown Tunnel, because effectively, you know, not based on, well, I guess there is an equivalence between fares and charges and tolling. Would it be more helpful if politicians were just upfront saying this will be a continuing revenue stream rather than saying it's for the lifetime of the contract? I mean, I use the Dartford Crossing as a fantastic example. I think that should have ended over 10 years ago, but it's still going. I mean, your thoughts?
Bridges and tunnels, in addition to being potential revenue sources, are also political. We shall go to the Humber Bridge and Barbara Castle in one easy step with this. The truth is, obviously infrastructure would eventually, if the deal's done properly at the beginning, would eventually run beyond. I mean, it would get to the point when the infrastructure had all been paid for, the debt was gone, and then question who should benefit from the tolls at that point. All I'd say is, this is going to aggravate everybody in one go, I suspect, that, you know, given how hard it is for the public sector to get a grip of revenue streams to use for any purpose, and how unpopular additional taxes are, giving up one that the public's got used to is brave. Which is, I'm saying, so what I'm saying to you is, I see the point you're making, that if the thing's been paid for, why should people go on paying for it? All I'm saying is, you could then say, well, we've got this nice revenue stream, why don't we use it for something else?
Well, you mentioned Barbara Castle, and in place of strife comes to my mind in this place.
I was thinking of the Humber Bridge alone.
Far too middle-aged, yes, I agree. But I think with that example of Silvertown, not only is and obviously this goes from Ken to Boris to Sadiq, so this is I can't unfortunately just pin the blame completely on him. But, you know, it's you give a good example of why give up a charge that people are used to. Well, actually, Silvertown has the opposite effect, where people have been used to going through the Blackwall Tunnel for free, and now they're having to pay for it. So there's a flip side for using future charges. I see Manish nodding his head, for existing uses where people have never been charged, but now are.
Yeah, I mean, again, the way in which there was a bigger version of this debate in New York when their congestion pricing system was introduced, because, of course, New Jersey suddenly thought, well, all our residents are going to end up paying this charge when, you know, it's outside our jurisdiction. And there's long been an argument there about some of the bridges and tunnels are tolled and some of them aren't. I mean, all I'd say is with this one is I suspect the new infrastructure wouldn't have been built without the toll, and then you're into the pragmatic question of what would have happened. I think this is TfL's argument. What would have happened if one was tolled and the other wasn't? And then you're in the sort of world well beyond my own understanding of the M6 toll and the parable of the M6 toll road. So that's not an answer, really, is it?
No,
but
no.
It's an interesting rumination, I hope.
Ruminating is what we're about in Budget Committee. So thank you so much, Tony.
If I can maybe add,
Manish, yeah.
if I can add maybe a couple of more perspectives, which is, look, I think given the choice, everyone would want free infrastructure, right? Everyone would want a shiny new bus, a shiny new train, which they don't need to pay for. But we don't have money. And when I say we, it's not TfL, we collectively don't have enough money. So therefore, we discussed earlier that, look, infrastructure needs a substantial amount of investment, and it can only come from three sources: the users, the beneficiary, or the taxpayer. And therefore, going back to Silvertown, I think it's fair to say that, look, you know, it's a new piece of infrastructure. Someone has to pay for it. And the choice, therefore, is either the users pay for it or the taxpayer pays for it, right? So that's, I think, where I feel that levying the low toll was probably the only way we could have done it.
I'd just respond politely, saying just because you can create infrastructure doesn't mean you always should. And so we're tolling Blackwall Tunnel to pay for a woke cycling bus. So, you know, I'll leave it there. But thank you, Chair.
Let me end on a brighter note by saying, since you mentioned the Humber crossing, it was one of the first school trips I ever went on, and it just shows where these things can lead. It was quite a new bridge back then, just to return to the are people middle-aged or not question. But thank you very much to our panel for your answers this morning. It's been very, on the whole, enlightening and interesting. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow. We've got part 2 when we're looking at how we can do all these things much cheaper and faster, which makes them easier to pay for, of course. But thank you very much for our panel and to our questions. You're now free to leave. We've got a little bit of housekeeping just to finish off, but if you have other things to do, you're very welcome to get on with doing them. So can I ask the committee to note the report and discussion and delegate authority to me as Chairman in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? And then very quickly, let me rattle through 5 things. Can I ask the committee to note the quarterly monitoring reports? Can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's decision list for the period 7th of March to 8th of May 2025, 9th of May to 5th of June 2025, 6th of June to the, 6th of June to the 27th of June 2025, and decide whether to highlight any issues for detailed consideration? Can I ask the committee to note the report on payments over £250? Can we note the committee's work programme and its meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025? And as previously advertised, the next meeting of the committee is tomorrow morning here in the chamber at City Hall at 10 a.m. And I have no further business, so that concludes this morning's meeting. Thanks, everyone.
This is the broadcast